Number 10. The Young Tsar. Being the leader of a nation is hard. I play a lot of city builders, trust me, I know. Being the leader of a nation whose people have been brutally oppressed by your family's dynasty for 300 years and in general living in very poor conditions, especially compared to the rest of the world, that's hard too. Even harder. Nicholas II inherited the throne from his father, which sounds great, but in reality was a lot of pressure to do so. As it turns out, Russia was in need of drastic change, and they would get it from the people and a bald man with very pointy facial hair. A communist revolution saw the Empire of Russia fall. 300 years of Romanov rule end overnight, as the Tsar was forced to abdicate his throne. So what's his crime? Well, not doing anything. Negligence. He did so much nothing that people had to do something. Number 9. Nero's steam. We've talked about Emperor Nero quite a lot on this channel, but that's because he's the down bad Roman emperor who puts opulence in Pax Romana. It's hard to pinpoint an exact crime or moment from him, as he's the guy you think about when you think of Roman emperors. However, his crimes against his wife Claudia Octavia are very notable. So when Nero was getting remarried, he had to get rid of Octavia. I mean, you can't have like 40 wives, that's you gotta get rid of her. But how? I mean, how do you get rid of a woman like that? He actually did the whole James Bond villain thing where the victim gets placed into a trap. It's very crude, but theatrical, because remember, theatrics are important, remember that folks. Hence, Octavia was banished to an island where shortly after she was locked into a vapor bath, where she suffocated. Naturally, to make himself look better, they made it look like she did it, not him. So yeah, what a great guy. What an absolute hero in that story. Definitely not a villain. Number 8. Afzal Khan. Everyone remembers King Henry VIII for doing what he did to his wives. Nazi, slap on the wrist, Nazi, don't do that, for shame. However, I would like to offer Afzal Khan as the alternative monster here. He didn't unalive a handful of wives like Henry, no. He actually managed to rack up a count of 63. Yep, you heard me right, 63. First off, I don't know how you have that many wives and or remember names, let alone birthdays and anniversaries. I would not do very well in that situation. Well, what's the reason for all this blood spilling? It's pretty horrible, actually. Simply because he was being invaded, and the guy who was invading him and winning was slightly nicer to women and was going to most likely give them a better life. Jeez, talk about if I can't have it, no one can. God. Number 7. Caligula's wife. I think in a healthy relationship, you ought to put your partner on a pedestal. Maybe your partner is drop dead gorgeous, a promising athlete, or really enjoys building Legos. Nice TIE fighter, babe, way to go. Yeah. Emperor Caligula of Rome liked to put his wife on a pedestal, literally. And while on this pedestal, she was wearing nothing but her birthday suit. Oh boy. Well, all of his friends, politicians, generals got to gawk and stare at her, and in some weird goth power flex, he would oftentimes hold a knife to her and tell her that he could just end her life whenever he wanted because he can do that. Not to mention the guy had a complete narcissist complex, building statues of himself everywhere just so she can like, oh great, there he is again, it's him again. Number 6. Genghis Khan. I bring the man up again because he's responsible for so much loss, so much blood spill, so much pain. Sure, they were effective warriors and archers, but they were brutal, dude, especially him. They took what they wanted when they wanted, and it's said that he was responsible for so many lives lost that it affected the carbon footprint of the planet. Dude, that's insane. That is literally insane. Also to note his treatment of rather mistreatment of women. YouTube won't let me say much, but I can tell you that these ladies were not inviting him into their bedrooms. It wasn't good. As it stands today, because of his bedroom misconduct, his DNA still lives on. 5% of men worldwide share his DNA.
When you marry that many women, however, it's actually easy to see where his heart laid. Years before his death, Henry made plans to build a monumental tomb for himself, but also Jane Seymour. She truly was his favorite queen, the one woman he definitely loved, and the mother of his only surviving male heir. Henry went as far as to confiscate a black marble sarcophagus that was originally intended for the powerful churchman Cardinal Wolsey to be used at the center of their tomb. The monumental tomb was in the works for most of his time on the throne, but during the tumultuous years after his death in 1547, it was never completed. So Henry and Jane were left to rest in peace in what was going to be temporary lodgings in Windsor Castle until said monument was all wrapped up. But it never did, and the kingdom was so bankrupt that it didn't really ever come around. So completing it seemed a little impractical. It had been a long time, and Henry's intended tomb is now actually home to another famous figure. 2.5 centuries later, the sarcophagus became part of an ornate national monument, the final resting place of Horatio Nelson, the great British naval hero of the Napoleonic Wars. Anyways, on to his children, because these poor guys were nearly victims of their dad's dirty plan. For the longest time, Henry didn't have a legitimate male heir, so he decided to concoct what, had it come to fruition, might have been the grossest marriage ever, although I feel like the Habsburgs would hear that sentence and as a challenge say, hold my beer. Anyways, Jane may have popped out Henry's only official heir, but he did have an illegitimate son by his mistress. Henry Fitzroy, a surname that literally means son of the king, so a hilarious thing to name your bastard child, was named Duke of Richmond. In order to ensure that his country didn't descend into literal war again over lack of male heir, King Henry wanted Fitzroy to be the next monarch. How, may you ask? Why, marry the boy to his half-sister Mary. This plan got so close to fruition that the couple already had the green light from the Pope. Thankfully, Fitzroy was in love and married someone else. When Fitzroy died at age 17, it left the door open for Henry's legitimate kids to take the throne. Thankfully, as mentioned, Jane ensured both daughters as well as the son got their chance. And speaking of Fitzroy's half-sister, Bloody Mary, she wasn't the only family member that wasn't all there. Henry the Hectic is next. It's widely known that quite a few of these famous noble and aristocratic lines were also plagued by mental illness. Various theories have pointed at Henry's syphilis and brain injuries as possible causes. After all, it would be logical to assume that the damage occurred to the frontal lobes from having a horse buck him off twice. That region of the brain processes impulse control, external cues from other actions, and social and lustuous behavior. He also began to comfort eat around this period. Everyone's heard of that person who's had a stroke and just wasn't the same afterwards. So brain damage likely could be the explanation. In 2020, researchers actually discovered what they believe is the site where Henry received the blow to his head that could have caused traumatic brain injury. But it might come down to hereditary psychiatric problems in the family. His paternal great-grandmother Catherine of Valois was the daughter of the famously mentally ill King Charles III. Her family's psychiatric issues seem to have been passed down through generations to multiple British monarchs. In his later years, Henry had a significant personality shift towards paranoia, fits of rage, depression, and anxiety, and he sent crowds of prisoners to the Tower of London. He sent more men and women to their deaths than any other English monarch, an estimated 57 to 72,000 people. Yikes, dictator numbers. But one thing about Henry, no matter how unhealthy homeboy got, he earned that chub. Huge misconception. Henry was only morbidly obese in the last few years of his life. For a long time before that, however, he was one of the most handsome and hella fit men of his era. Dude was well over 6 foot and had a 34-inch waist. In 1536, Henry was taking part in a tournament when he fell off his horse and the horse fell on him, leaving the king unconscious for several hours and forever altering his cheerful, outgoing personality. This is the second horse-related mass head injury Henry sustained. After this injury and the further ulcer development in his legs, Henry was left pretty much unable to exercise. His made-to-measure suits of armor chart the king's expansion, with his final set around 1540, suggesting he weighed more than 300 pounds with a waist of 54 inches. As a matter of fact, Henry was so overweight he needed a mechanical device to help him get in and out of bed. When he died in 1547, he weighed nearly 400 pounds with a 60-inch waist. Impressive in a time before 10 cheeseburgers for $10, but I mean, if you're over 50, ruled a kingdom, injured his health for around 30 years, you can just let go, who cares? And last, but never the least, Henry was a hypochondriac king. Henry was obsessed with sickness and disease, specifically the sweating sickness and the plague. This is pretty fair. By the age 30, he'd already caught smallpox and malaria a couple times. Anytime there was an outbreak of anything, he would minimize his risk of infection by straight up leaving London and limiting the number of ambassadors he saw. Even when Anne Boleyn caught the sweating sickness in 1528, Henry said peace and stayed far away until she got better. Henry, bad husband. Good infection minimizer though. Naturally, like any germaphobe, Henry was doing the most to feel clean. So he was known to self-medicate. He even wrote his own prescription book, which detailed how to treat ulcers and reduce inflammation. He diagnosed himself with so many illnesses and disorders that it was actually hard to keep track of all of them. From migraines to insomnia and gout, Henry's life was spent dealing with and or avoiding various different diseases and ailments. Despite his many tyrannical qualities, Henry wasn't all that bad. He actually improved English medicine due to his outlandish paranoias, bringing the country further into the Renaissance. As the founder of the Royal College of Physicians, the king also passed 7 different laws to control the practice of medicine. medicine. In 1540, Henry pushed through one of the earliest laws to regulate drugs. Apothecary wares had to be checked to make sure no one was defrauding honest customers. His reign also contributed to the increase of supervision of sewers, thanks to his chancellor and future victim Sir Thomas More, who drastically improved the quality of London's public water supply.
Number 10, King Charles I. You can put any king down on this list, really. People weren't as kind and loving as we are now. Or well, less cruel, I guess. King Charles was no different from any other, a monarch sniffing his own farts up in his castle, doing his very best to snuff out religious groups that he didn't agree with. A lot of guys were like that. It's brutal, but that's history, folks. Well, one such measure he took, I think, was so wrong, so heinous, and so criminal, and so offensive that he should have been locked up for life. During the 1600s, this man, in an effort to curb religious views, outlawed Christmas. Yeah, that's right. Outlawed Christmas. That means no gifts, no tree, no Santa Claus, no turkey, no stuffing, no nothing. This was quickly dissolved after he was removed from office. And yes, I know Santa Claus wasn't there then, but it's Santa Claus. It's Christmas. Can't have Christmas without Santa Claus. Number 9, William the Conqueror. You've all probably heard the name William the Conqueror. Battle of Hastings, illegitimate son of the king fighting for the throne. Very violently too, I might add. However, today I want to talk about his dating skills. Look, dating can be hard. I get that. There's a lot of anxiety, especially when self-image comes into play. Ooh, I'm too fat. I hate my nose. And what are these legs? Ugh, no one's gonna like me. Everyone thinks like that. And it's always usually right before a date, too. You could be staring in the mirror and then all of a sudden all your bruises, pimples, and blemishes seem to show up out of nowhere. It's weird how that works. Well, William was different though. He was more confident. He didn't have confidence issues like the rest of us. To quote a brilliant chemist, he was the one who knocks. As the story goes, he was quite fond of one lass. She was not fond of him. Classic story, really. So after trying to court her several times and failing, he decided to drag her on the ground by her hair until she said yes. Don't do that. That's bad. Number 8, Genghis Khan. I don't think some folks realize just how brutal this guy really was. I mean, if you've ever played the Ghost of Tsushima game on PlayStation, then you know exactly what the Mongol horde is capable of. Naughty things. The man carved out most of Asia and parts of Europe. In one battle, allegedly taking the lives of 1 million people. And all that remained was a mountain of bones and human fat. Ugh, gross. He's been known on how not to treat a lady and reportedly liked to use his young and newest soldiers as arrow fodder by creating human shields with them. A lot of conscripts in his army were often taken from villages that he conquered. It's kind of how he kept the machine going. So either fight with me or that's picture wrap for you. What a nice guy. What a swell nice guy. Jeez. Number 7, Galeazzo Maria Sforza. This guy was just bad. Like all bad. Not like Deadpool where he does some bad stuff for good reasons, anti-hero kind of guy. This guy's just straight bad, straight evil. In one story of the Disturbed King, he had a rival's hands chopped off. No more tennis matches. He left prisoners in hanging cages and even had a priest that made a prediction about him that he didn't find all too flattering in prison with little food and water. It got to the point where the man had to eat his own refuse. So if you cross Galeazzo Maria Sforza, don't do it. Number 6, Ivan the Terrible. I'm not that familiar with Russian history before the year 1900, but there is a lot to unpack. It's not all Lenin and hammers and sickles and such. Ivan the Terrible was the first Tsar of Russia, and he was quite the specimen. From having struck his daughter-in-law and unlifing his son in a fit of rage, he was one nasty dude. However, I believe the story of him in St. Basil's Cathedral is more noteworthy. As the story goes, Ivan commissioned an architect to build St. Basil's Cathedral. If you've ever seen it, you know how gorgeous it is. All the onion palace buildings and whatnot, you know what I'm talking about. Ivan was so impressed with the architect's work that he had his eyes gouged out so that no one could ever build another structure or gaze upon another structure as magnificent as the cathedral. That's hardcore, dude. That's pretty hardcore. So if you do a bad job, he probably would have got rid of you, and if you do a good job, he'll still get rid of you.
Number 5, Menkaure. Menkaure, a pharaoh who ruled in the 26th century BC, definitely had his doubts. When an oracle came to him and told him that he only had 6 years left to live, he was terrified, and he did everything he could to avoid it. And he decided he could fool the gods as long as the night never came. Menkaure figured if a new day never began, and time could not pass, and so he could not die. Right. So every night he lit up as many lamps as he could and convinced himself it was still daytime for the rest of his life. Menkaure would not sleep. He spent every night drinking and celebrating under artificial light, terrified of the moment when his light finally went out. But of course he did not die. Not sure if it was due to his age or the fact that it is not medically recommended to succumb to insomnia, as one would increase a risk of hypertension, diabetes, obesity, depression, heart attacks, and a stroke. He died at the age of 32 and ruled for roughly 18 to 22 years. Number 4, Thutmose I. Although history does call him a great leader as he was able to expand Egypt's empire in Nubia, which today is known as Sudan, as well as his advances in Syria, with his advancements like that also equals to a fair share of violence and catastrophes that affect the very people he plundered and pillaged. Known for his cruelty, which was on full HD display, he found a Nubian king and took off his head with his hands, and then sailed home with his body hanging on the ship's prow. He wanted to intimidate his rivals and potentially rebels from messing with him ever again. However, this stunt caused more problems as it led to multiple battles and wars. During the rules of monarchs, cults were formed to worship them, and Thutmose I's cult lasted for centuries after his death, which is an unusual occurrence, and this statue of monarch is at the heart of a tableau representing offerings and ceremonies in his honor. Number 3, Akhenaten. Egyptians had many gods, but for Akhenaten, he said, we're going to have one god, and it is the one I can only worship. Aten, the god of sun, is meant to major upheaval on how Egypt was run and took a lot of work to do it. So much in fact that he literally worked his people to death. He built a whole new city in honor of this god, moved 20,000 people there, and had them built it no matter how badly their bodies ached. These people had to push through everything. Based on the bones in the town cemetery, more than 2/3 of his workers broke a bone while they were working, and a good 1/3 of them broke their spines. The people were barely fed, and almost every person in the town was malnourished, and they were not allowed to do anything about it. If they broke rank and tried to snatch a little something extra, they were sentenced to be repeatedly poked with a sharp object. And that was all for nothing. As soon as Akhenaten died, everything he did was destroyed, and his very name was erased from Egyptian history. Number 2, Ramesses II. Ramesses lived so long that people started getting seriously worried that he might not never die. In a time when most kings got assassinated within their first few years, Ramesses II lived up to 91 years old. He enjoyed his time alive too. Right up to the very end, he built more statues and monuments than anyone ever, and he slept with more women than anyone ever too. By the time he died, Ramesses II had at least 100 children with at least 9 wives, and it took a lot of sleeping with women to get there, but he made sure he put those hours in. When he invaded Kedah, he refused to sign a peace treaty unless they handed over their eldest daughter, and he did not shy away from his daughters either. He married at least 3 of his own kids, including his firstborn. Number 1, the Ptolemy Pharaohs. Finally, at number 1, we have the Ptolemy Pharaohs. This family of mad kings are definitely on this list. Starting with Ptolemy IV, he eliminated his mother, who got rid of his dad for having an affair with her mom, which is his grandma, and then Ptolemy IV married his sister and then got rid of her after her brother's death. Are you with me so far? Because there's more. Ptolemy VI fought his brother Ptolemy V for the throne and married his sister Cleopatra II, and then Ptolemy VII was killed by his uncle, where Ptolemy VIII married Cleopatra II, but then he had an affair with her daughter Cleopatra III. Then she killed her sister Cleopatra IV and was later got by her widowed brother-in-law. I'm gonna go fast forward a bit because there's a lot of back and forth with the different Ptolemies and Cleopatras until we get to the one that we know. Cleopatra VII. As we know in history, that Cleopatra was the last ruler of Egypt. Basically, her father, Ptolemy XII, decapitated her sister because she hated him, and eventually Cleopatra VII had to marry her brother, got rid of him, married the other brother, and then also got rid of him, and then her sister dragged her through the streets of Rome as a prisoner because of Julius Caesar, and had her sister sacrificed at a temple because of her other lover, Mark Antony. These are terrible people and are definitely insane. Some were not too mad, some were just ambitious leaders with great desires to rule, and others were just insane. After all, we could only gather so much from what we know from history, especially from these times.
Starting off this list at our number 10 spot, we have Ivan IV, more commonly known as Ivan the Terrible. He was the son of Vasily III, who was the Rurikid ruler of the Grand Duchy of Moscow. After his father's death, however, at just 3 years old, Ivan was named the Grand Prince, and by the time he was 16, he was declared as the Tsar or Emperor of Russia, officially establishing the Tsardom of Russia. Ivan and his reign are certainly known for the transformation of Russia from a medieval state to an empire, but not without a huge cost to the people of Russia, as well as a hit to the long-term economy. Ivan has been described as being intelligent and devout, but also prone to paranoia, rage, and episodic outbreaks of mental instability that only increased the older he got. One of the main points of extreme violence and viciousness was the massacre of Novgorod, which saw the deaths of an estimated 2,000 to 15,000 people, as well as a shocking amount of acts of extreme, violent cruelty. In the later years, like I mentioned, his violent tendencies only got worse, which led to him doing things like striking his heir in the heat of an argument so badly that it left him with brain damage. In the end, Ivan the Terrible met his demise from a heart attack in 1584. Yeah, they say that impaling hundreds of people every day isn't great for the heart health. Someone should have let him know about vitamins and minerals, or maybe some good cardio-heavy exercise. I don't know. In our number 9 spot today, we have Leopold II. As the second king of the Belgians, Leopold has been said to be responsible for the deaths of somewhere between 2 to 15 million people. Yeah, million. It wasn't in Belgium that he committed his atrocious acts, however. It all started when he claimed himself to be the founder and sole owner of the Congo Free State, which was a private project he undertook on his own. Leopold loved colonialism. He wanted to colonize everything he possibly could, and this is why he started the International African Society, which he used to travel to Africa, claim land that obviously wasn't his, and we're not talking about a small piece, we're talking about land that is several times the size of Belgium, and many countries just let him do this and allowed him to freely rule this land. This is definitely already bad enough, but of course things only got worse. Leopold had his own private militia that he used to force the indigenous population into hard labor. While Leopold was doing this, of course, for economic reasons, he also was just doing this because he was a messed up guy. He was terrible. He made those who lived here harvest and process rubber, and the punishments for those who didn't harvest enough for him were extremely severe. Not to mention, it is also said that sometimes he would just inflict harm because he could. Eventually, a stop needed to be put to his wrongdoings, but of course he was going to do everything he could to hide some of the horrors he did. The entire archive of the Congo Free State was burned, and he told his aide that even though the Congo had been taken from him, quote, "they have no right to know what I did there." The Congo was taken from him, but remained under the rule of Belgium in 1908 until the Congo was given independence in 1960. As for Leopold, well, he remained the ruler of Belgium until his death in 1909, but the secret was out now, and no one liked him. In fact, his funeral procession was booed by the crowd because everyone was angry at him for the things that he had done. In our number 8 spot today, we have Qin Shi Huang. While this leader is often credited with creating the first unified Chinese empire, the Qin dynasty, these accomplishments didn't come cheap. When he came to power in 221 BCE, he strictly followed 7 principles, which not only pushed for severe punishment, but also acted in contraries and issued unattainable orders. He also is said to have been extremely paranoid about the power of the educated, which led to him burning books so that no one could ever learn what was in them, and he also killed 460 Confucian scholars in just 1 year, which some claim was because they were unable to make him immortal. Huang wanted not only to establish a transport system, but also build a wall to keep out enemies, and this meant that he had to relocate at least 120,000 families. He declared that all would be equal under one law, and then taxed everyone heavily, and because of these heavy taxes as well as the insane labor that was expected to create the wall and the transport system, thousands of people were overworked, starved, and perished. He also had laborers create a massive tomb for him, complete with 8,000 life-size terracotta warriors and horses, which you may be familiar with because now it is rumored to be an extremely haunted place. I mean, an evil ruler's resting place? Yeah, of course it's haunted. In our number 7 spot today, we have Don Carlos. I'll be honest, this little troublemaker never made it to the title of king, but he sure was a little too close for comfort when you hear about the kind of things he was doing. Carlos was the Prince of Asturias during the mid-1500s, as he was the eldest son of King Philip II of Spain. It is said that Carlos may have had some troubles right from birth, which many believe could be due to the inbreeding that was common in the family at the time. Descriptions of his behaviors, though, are far worse than what anyone could have expected. It is said that Carlos did horrible things like hurting or taking the lives of animals just for fun. I mean, nowadays we call that a huge warning sign for potential killers. Back then they just chalked it up to boys being boys. It is even said that at one point he purposefully blinded all of the horses in the royal stable. Red flags, they were abundant. Soon, of course, his cruelties would extend to humans, with people claiming that one time he chose to whip a servant girl for no reason other than because he could. And apparently one time he made a shoemaker eat a pair of shoes that he had made the prince that he didn't like. He was just a little twerp. Carlos was set up by his family to marry the eldest daughter of King Henry II, but after a few few hours with the man, she decided there's no way in hell. Like, he was so bad, she would rather marry his dad, which she did in 1560. In the end, Carlos was found to be plotting to take out his own father, which landed him in prison in solitary confinement, where he passed away 6 months later. In our number 6 spot today, we have King Charles VI. King Charles VI started off his reign by being very well loved and respected, but as time went on over his 4 decades of ruling, he ended up being known as Charles the Mad. His erratic behavior had him hacking up knights, imagining that he was St. George, and he would also have bouts of amnesia where he would be able to recognize some people but not his wife and children. This is all very strange and of course quite sad, as he was obviously exhibiting signs of extreme mental illness, but one of the strangest symptoms was him believing that he was made of glass. He was terribly frightened of falling or being jostled too hard, and he would actually insert iron rods into his clothing to try and keep himself from shattering. But then he would also apparently run wild at top speeds throughout the halls of the castle or the streets, which would obviously mean that he was totally abandoning his fear of fragility. It apparently got so bad that he had to be held inside with the entrances bricked up. Sadly, he continued on this path until he passed away in 1422.
At number 5, too many castles. King Ludwig II of Bavaria, also known as the Swan King or the Fairy Tale King, was the monarch from 1864 until his passing in 1886. Ludwig was a fan of the opera, arts, and spending money in an irresponsibly extravagant way. When Ludwig took the throne, he was only 18, and he increasingly withdrew from day-to-day affairs of state in favor of extravagant artistic and architectural projects. Today, the former king is known for his fairy tale castles, Neuschwanstein Castle, Linderhof Place, and Herrenchiemsee. Ludwig certainly had a talent, with his impressive castles being the inspiration behind Walt Disney's Cinderella Castle, but he got a little carried away building one too many castles. He was also a devoted patron of the composer Richard Wagner. Ludwig spent all his own private royal revenues on these projects, borrowed extensively, and defied all attempts by his ministers to restrain him. Ludwig's castles left him in increasing debt, and in 1886 a group of conspirators filed a medical report drafted by doctors who hadn't actually examined him that declared him permanently unfit to rule. The next morning, he and his personal physician were found floating in a lake under mysterious circumstances that many believed to be homicide. At number 4, funeral for a doll. Tsar Peter III of Russia was the emperor from January 5th, 1762 until January 9th of the same year, being thrown over by his wife Catherine the Great. Catherine earned her nickname simply due to her being just that, great. But her husband, on the other hand, according to every account, was creepy, malevolent, and possibly bordering on insane. In her memoirs, Catherine describes him herself as an inept, crude man-child and a drunkard unfit to rule an empire, who wished nothing but to play with toys or dress up as a general, place his servants in military outfits, and play war games with them. Peter was also known for loving, collecting, and playing with toy soldiers in his room. One day, Catherine found a rat hanging on his wall. According to The Empire of Russia, Its Rise and Present Power by John Stevens, Catherine wrote, quote, "One day when I went into the apartments of His Imperial Highness, I beheld a great rat which he had hanged with all the paraphernalia of an execution. I asked what all this meant. He told me that this rat had committed a great crime, which according to the laws of war deserved capital punishment. Basically, the rat had chewed the head off one of his beloved dolls, he wanted a full funeral, and Catherine wanted nothing to do with him." At number 3, enemas. King Louis XIV of France ruled from May 1643 until September 1715. The former French ruler was apparently quite a big fan of using enemas on a regular basis. If you don't know, an enema involves inserting fluid into the lower bowel through the rectum, aiming to empty the bowels, often for a medical examination or administering medication. To be fair, back then it was a common thing to do among royals and nobles of Europe, as it was thought to be very good for your health. Even so, Louis was the enema king. Rumor has it that Louis XIV had thousands of enemas performed throughout his life. It was not uncommon that the king excused himself after dinner, went to his private apartment, had an enema, and then returned to join his courtiers. The king ended up living quite a long life, 76 years, and he credited his long life to his regular enemas. The elite of France were not going to be using just any water for this delicate practice either. Instead, the fluids were perfumed with rose, orange, and angelica, and was
was even slightly colored by the request of the users. Louis's father and grandfather had been fond of enemas too, but he preferred his with almond milk. During one year, he had 212 enemas performed. At number 2, mummies. Similar to those who paid for mumia to heal them, King Charles II of England kept a number of mummies. They were not for educational or entertainment purposes, but simply to gather their dust. This dust was made up of dried skin and whatever else you might find on a mummified corpse, and Charles would actually rub it all over his own body. I guess back then they really hoped that the deceased had magical healing powers, but looking back now, knowing what we do, that's just nasty. Could you imagine just showering in mummy dust thinking, this is gonna make me so great? Charles II believed that by doing this he could acquire some ancient pharaoh greatness for himself. To be fair, they had a lot of wild beliefs back then, so this wasn't unheard of, but paying for a corpse's dead skin is still insane. King Charles wasn't done there either. He also paid gravediggers to bring him cadavers so he could use their skulls to make an alcoholic concoction called the King's Drops, which he prepared in his personal laboratory. These drops were made from crushed up human skulls and skull moss from Ireland, and the king purchased the concoction for 6,000 euros. And at number 1, tall men. King Frederick Wilhelm I of Prussia ruled from February 1713 until May 1740 and was the founder of the Potsdam Giants. This name was given to the Prussian Infantry Regiment No. 6. This group of soldiers was made up of men above 6 feet tall and was eventually dissolved in 1806 after being defeated by Napoleon. Frederick recruited these tall men willingly and unwillingly from various nations. The king himself only stood 5'3" tall, and the taller soldiers were believed to be a pretty obvious case of overcompensation. Eventually, Frederick became a little too obsessed with collecting gigantic men that he eventually resorted to buying, taking, or breeding them into the regiment to booster his ranks. Frederick Wilhelm was apparently not nice to his troops, treating them more like possessions to show off rather than humans. The king would show off his troops like toys to foreign dignitaries and even painted portraits of them as they marched at his command. The king once said, "The most beautiful girl or woman in the world would be a matter of indifference to me, but tall soldiers, they are my weakness." By the time he passed, the number of tall soldiers had climbed to 2,500, and Potsdam was littered with unusually tall men by the 18th century.
Starting with his entrusted and encrusted crap man. In Henry's court, his servants vied to be as physically close to the king as possible at all times. In case you aren't aware, especially towards the end of his reign, Henry was a tad bit of a lunatic. The more he liked you, the less likely you were to die for looking at him funny on a bad day of his. But naturally, the monarch reserved the honor of being close to his royal person only for a trusted few people, the grooms of the stools. No, not his counselor, personal butler, none of his advisor, the guy that wiped his ass. And during his reign, only 4 men got the gig of groom of the stool, the most physically intimate position and therefore the most honored of his attendants. These grooms not only helped dress and undress the king before and after the bathroom and, handled the poop brush for him, but in an insane twist, they also controlled public and personal access to the monarch and some of his finances. They even had power over a stamp of the king's signature, which is a major financial tool. Imagine being one of his wives and having to ask the guy who wiped your husband's if you can talk to him, and he says no. But if he could afford that kind of luxury employee, why was he called the copper-nosed king? Easy. While Henry's kingdom amassed a great wealth and property during the English Reformation by confiscating Catholic monasteries, Henry then turned around and drove England into debt with his overspending and lavish lifestyle. Dude was a complete eclectic, and he wanted to buy everything shiny and pretty he saw, so he did. It's reported by the time he dropped, Henry owned approximately 50 palaces, 6,500 plus weapons, 70 ships, 78 recorders, 78 flutes, 5 sets of bagpipes, and a virginal. Get your mind out of the gutter, it's a type of harpsichord. Not to mention the millions of dollars he pumped into wars with Scotland and France. So it's pretty obvious he was burning through the kingdom's funds, and by the end of his reign, Henry had it down to the pocket change, quite literally. He was forced to lower the percentage of silver in the British coinage to the point that they were mostly copper with the silver coating that wore away from the coin's embossed image of Henry's face, starting with the nose. Thus, copper nose. When Henry's son Edward took the throne, the royal coffers were in a real bad state. But before we get to his love life and kiddos, let's learn about how frisky runs in the family. It's well known that Henry's older brother, the first husband of Henry's first wife, Catherine, died young. But did you know he had 2 royal sisters who made his life a living hell for fun? Henry's older sister Margaret was just as feisty as her brother. She was sent to Scotland to marry that country's king, James IV, at just 13. She did produce an heir after a couple years, the future James V, but her crappy adulterous playboy spouse didn't live terribly long. So, as a single queen, Margaret wanted to keep up her luxe lifestyle at her brother Henry's expense, which he did not love. Maggie battled it out with the Scottish nobles over the right to serve as her son's regent, but she fell for and married another Scottish noble, the Earl of Angus. Henry's other sister, Mary, had some equally troublesome marriage issues, at least for Henry. He married her first to the elderly King Louis of France, but that monarch passed away very shortly after. A smart woman who recognized being married to a literal senior could kind of work in her favor made Henry promise her before her marriage if she was to be widowed, her next husband would be a man of her own choosing. Henry agreed, which hilariously was a bad idea but only for him, because now a widow, Mary chose to wed a commoner who was Henry's best friend, Charles Brandon. The king was furious that Mary would marry against his will, since he had no intention of keeping his promise to her, and that her second wedding took away the opportunity for him to make alliances using her. But Mary and Brandon told him to suck it and stayed married till her death. Their descendants included the Lady Jane Grey, the infamous 9-day queen. And before he went around dismantling religions to get some nookie, Henry was a devout choir boy. You might know Henry as the king who split from Rome and brought around the Anglican faith, but in his youth, Henry was a vehement supporter of Catholicism and its head. He sent tin from Cornwall to adorn the roof of Pope Julius II's new palace. He supported the papacy, and in 1521 even published a book-length slam poem against the German Protestant reformer Martin Luther. He referred to Luther as a venomous serpent, a pernicious plague, an infernal wolf, an infectious soul, a detestable trumpeter of pride, calumnies, and schism. In recognition of Henry's forceful piety, Pope Leo X, I can't remember that number, awarded him the title of Fidei de Defensor, aka Defender of the Faith. Henry was actually going to join the church himself before his older brother Arthur died and left him a throne and a wife to take care of. Scarcely a decade after being called Defender of Faith, Henry led a schism of his own, cleaving the Church of England into the wider Catholic Church after the Pope Clement refused to annul Henry's 16-year marriage to Catherine. Oh, it's time, y'all, because you may have known he was a womanizer, but did you know Henry was also a consistent king? What do I mean? Have you guys ever paid attention to the names of his wives? So, they were Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr. So it went Catherine, Anne, Jane, Anne, Catherine, Catherine. I feel like if Henry had lived longer, there would have been another Anne and a Jane that would have come along, and then another Catherine. Ironically, Jane Seymour, the middle wife and the only unique name in the bunch, was Henry's favorite, but more on that sappy tale in a bit. There's a common belief that Henry married and discarded his 6 wives in quick succession, but that's not exactly true. When Henry's older brother died, he inherited a kingdom and a wife, Catherine, and they remained married for nearly 24 years. During that time, Catherine was faithful to Henry, but Henry was sticking it in any lady he could find, except Anne Boleyn, who made him wait. So his answer, annul a whole marriage just to get some. But as mentioned, Pope wouldn't do that, so Henry had to start a whole new religion just so he could. Guess he shouldn't have done that, because Henry gets so desperate to end the relationship with Anne, he makes up allegations, maybe history's rocky on that, of adultery and treason, and had the marriage annulled and her beheaded. Jane had served as a lady-in-waiting to both Catherine and Anne, and I kid you not, Anne and Jane had gotten in actual fistfights because of Anne's jealousy, so just picture a 15th century catfight. On October 12, 1537, Jane gave birth to Edward, their only male heir, and then died from complications due to the birth several weeks later. This is the only woman Henry had actually truly loved, and the loss decimated him for 2 years. His next wife, another Anne, catfished him with her portrait. Turns out she's ugly, and they amicably divorced after 6 months, so she lives out her life in comfy luxury in the country. Smart woman. The next Catherine was all young and hot at the time when Henry was repugnant and unable to walk, and it was more of a classic sugar baby situation. She cheated a bunch and got beheaded. The final Catherine was a grown, mature adult woman, shockingly a widow or two, and of all of Henry's wives, Catherine had the most influence on the court culture, religion, and role of women, and she also persuaded Henry to restore his daughters Mary and Elizabeth to the order of succession.
Number 5. George V. Turned out this guy loved stamps. Maybe a bit too much though, I'd say. It was almost distracting. It was taking up many hours of his day. Like, focus on other things, like say maybe, I don't know, the war. King George V continued to collect stamps during World War I. Everyone's trying to stay alive. George is just in the background like... Like all collections, they started at an early age. It's now at a point where it's just, past impressive and borderline strange, especially if you're a royal, like you're really going hard with this. This guy had albums on albums of stamps. He had around 330 albums, each was 60 pages, full of stamps. That's 20,000 pages full of stamps. That's a lot, way too many stamps. So naturally, he was nicknamed the King of Stamps, or rather the King of Philately. That's the official term for collecting stamps. We're historians here, we have to make it official. Back in 1905, he set an all-time stamp record. Ho-ho! The most money ever spent on a stamp. This guy dropped like 220,000 on one single stamp. Somebody even asked the prince down the road if he had heard about the fool who had spent 1,400 pounds on a stamp. And he was proud. He was like, oh, that fool? It was I. Number 4. Rudolph II, the Holy Roman Emperor from 1552. He was known as a collector. Yeah, some princes collected stamps, others collect zoo animals. We're all different. Yeah, his castle was home to lions, tigers, and not bears, but orangutans, so good luck getting your 8 hours. He also collected human artifacts, like body parts after they've been, so that's watch your step, I guess. Welcome to MTV Cribs, don't mind the jar of eyes, watch out for the lion's tail, careful. What a mess. He's quite important in history though, I guess. He supported the scientific revolution, and he also poured tons of money into astrology, so next time you read your horoscope, remember it's Bones in the Jar Benny that's responsible for that one. And also, in case you're wondering, yeah, he didn't pay attention to any of his wives or anything like that. He was just, no, jars for me, jars animals, I'm all set. Number 3, Don Carlos. Spanish Crown Prince, the guy who just enjoyed being the worst human alive. Let's talk about him. Back in the mid-1500s, the eldest son to King Philip II of Spain was, yeah, I want to say worse things, but he was just a really bad person. YouTube, he was just a bad guy. Now, it's been noted that he was born with a hunchback and one leg was shorter than the other. Historians like to bring that up first, and how maybe he had the odds against him with these disabilities growing up, and people often feel bad for him a little. To that I say, don't. Nah, don't do it. Don Carlos was made hero of the opera by his dad. Dude was fine. Philip II of Spain? Yeah, he would hurt a lot of people. He would hurt animals and people just for fun. According to historians, Don Carlos once made a cobbler eat a pair of boots because he didn't like how the pair of boots looked. He made somebody eat boots. We're not gonna feel bad for him on Bumblebee today. That's not what we're gonna do. He was also set up to marry Queen Elizabeth of Valois, the eldest daughter of King Henry II, but after a few hours, she was like, no, that's not gonna happen. No way. So she married his father instead. That's what happens. That's what happens when you're In 1564, a few brides were lined up for Don Carlos. Mary, Queen of Scots, was one of them. Margaret of Valois, we know what happened with her, and Anna of Austria. But his mental conditions grew worse and it went south. Shocker. Number 2, Heart of Glass. King Charles VI, once nicknamed the Beloved and then quickly nicknamed the Mad. What happened? After he became King of France in 1380, he would have these episodes, let's call them. He would believe he was made of glass and he didn't want anybody to touch him. He had this glass delusion, which was surprisingly not uncommon, believe it or not, for this time period. Believing you were made out of glass in some way, shape, or form, be it in your head, butt, shoulders, or back, really spiked around the mid-1400s, and Charles VI, aka Charles the Mad, he wouldn't let anybody, not even his wife, near him at all. I'm not making fun of somebody for having a fear like that. I mean, most likely historians believe he was schizophrenic, so obviously I'm not ripping on that. But Alexandria of Bavaria, another royal who had this glass delusion, she too believed she had swallowed a grand piano made of glass, so she had to enter rooms sideways to avoid it shattering. I don't know what's going on with this glass delusion, but I'm glad it went away. I don't know. And finally, number 1, King George IV. Voted as England's worst king by historians, so that should already tell you a good amount of this guy. George was another one of those monarchs who was a little too invested in his, intimate side quests, if you know what I'm saying here, like all these other kings we've talked about. He was a bit busy, being a stupid fool. This man was trying literally everything to get a woman to sleep with him. Although he was the king and he was already set up, he was like, nope, I'm gonna go and keep trying with strangers and random. And he would throw a tantrum if they said no, or he would threaten to end his own life if he didn't get the girl. Like, you know what I'm saying? One of those kind of monsters. He would also keep trophies, lack of a better term, of all these conquests afterwards. He would ask each people that he slept with for a little piece of hair, and then he would keep them. He would store them. Back then it was kind of common, I guess, for lovers to keep locks of each other's hair. Weirdly enough, because you don't have phone numbers or any sort of way to remember someone, photos, I don't know. So you kept their hair. But after the king died, his brother found 7,000 envelopes, each with a lock of hair that was, quote, enough to stuff a sofa, end quote. So yeah, I'll leave you on that note. there's a hair in my mouth. That's kind of gross.
Number 10, Pepe II. When you were 6 years old, I'm pretty sure the only responsibility you had was to tell your mom if you wet the bed by accident, or making sure you clean up after yourself, and of course, just being a kid. But for Pepe II, this was a tiny child ruling a massive kingdom. His priorities was to rule Egypt and be the young king he was literally born to be. I mean, hey, at least this 6-year-old has a job, so what's your excuse? Now, keep in mind, this was a 6-year-old and he was obviously at one point going to be extremely spoiled, and of course court members would travel everywhere to impress him with gifts. So one of his court members got him a dancing pygmy from Africa, knowing very well his new young pharaoh was going to freak the heck out seeing him. Pepe was so obsessed and extremely attached to the dancer that he told the man who found the pygmy that he was under strict rules to make sure nothing happens to him. In life, or in death, he better take care of his personal dancer, and when Pepe got older, his demands started getting more like Cusco from the Emperor's New Groove, plus a little bit more inhumane, where he had his slaves stripped naked and covered in honey. He did this because he wanted his slaves to follow him around just to keep the flies away. Either way, he was far the longest ruling Egyptian monarch at 94 years old, and Pepe's rule ended up in economy disarray due to virtually no oversight. Number 9. Pharaohs. There's always going to be P mentioned somewhere when it comes to history's gross weird acts, and I am sorry. Pharaohs was a pharaoh who suffered from blindness, and his father, Sesterus, may have passed it down to him, but of course Egyptian courts official said it was a curse. The assumption of the cause was because when Pharaoh was young, he threw a spear into the Nile River for flooding, and the gods got mad and struck him blind. 10 years later, Pharaoh was getting annoyed at his blindness, and so an oracle told him he can get his sight back if he washes his eyes with the urine of a woman who has never slept with anyone other than her husband. So he did just that. He would try to use his own wives, but it didn't work, which now him and his wife had to go to counseling for potential cheating, and so then he would have to go around town and ask every woman to pee in a pot and pour it into his eyes. Somehow it worked. He found a woman who wasn't cheating on her husband, and he got his eyesight back. He married her on the spot, burned his old wife, and that was that. Of course, it was unlikely that Pharaoh really got his sight back through magical urine, but he just needed a good story to explain his weird habit. Number 8, Cleopatra VII. I will briefly mention her chaotic and absolutely horrendous family in a moment, but Cleopatra VII, or as we know her as only and solely as Cleopatra, she was known not just for her intellect and beauty, but her Twilight love-like triangle relationships with Hot Bod, Julius Caesar, and raging wolfman Mark Antony. Of course, there is some debate if whether or not she was a mad king. After all, she was brilliant in using her tactics to ensnare and bewitch the minds and bodies of powerful men in order to ensure the security of her kingdom, but unfortunately her ego did get in the way and lost the battle with Mark Antony, and Egypt then became a province of the Roman Empire, bringing in an end to her reign. But the way she would try to manipulate these leaders would be one for the books. Kris Jenner works hard, but Cleopatra works harder. At one point she needed to seduce Julius Caesar, but she was not allowed at any point to get physical with him, let alone with him. So she would strip naked and rolled herself into some bed sheets or rugs and told his servants to DoorDash deliver her to his door. And when they said, "Hey Julius, we got a package for you," they rolled her out of those sheets and she rolled into his. And they gave that delivery a full 5 stars, tip included. But of course, the main reason why she's even on this list is because she assassinated her siblings, including the 2 she was married to, careless about the money like spending $10 to $20 million on a single meal, and of course brainwashing her citizens, believing that she was their goddess and allowing the downfall of Egypt through failed military tactics. Number 7, Xerxes I. He is often portrayed as a tyrant, and is likely that as a Persian king, his disregard for local traditions did not endear him to the Egyptians. Xerxes I was very much a pharaoh in absentia, where his failed attempts to invade Greece ensured that his portrayal by Greek historians was also seen in a Hollywood extension of the film 300 was not kind. He had a reputation for harsh punishments, womanizing, and draining the Persian Empire's coffers. He built immense palaces and other projects at Persepolis and left his mark on the history of both Europe and Asia. He was more or less a power-driven conqueror. All he wanted was to conquer Greece due to the conflicts his father had started. He would loot, pillage, enslave Persians, but eventually was defeated by Cyprus. Number 6, Pharaoh Psamtik III. I too would send my armies to protect cats, and even though I'm still upset about that one pope who declared people to kill a bunch of cats, this pharaoh seems to be pretty cool to me. Psamtik III, he knew that cats were considered the best, as cats were often associated with Bastet, who is the goddess of fertility, protection, and good health. As a result, it was considered a crime in ancient Egypt to harm or through inaction allow a cat to come to harm. But he had placed the well-being of cats above his own people when Pharaoh Psamtik III literally told his army not to fight because an army commander had released hundreds of cats onto the battlefield. That commander was the Persian king Cambyses II, who, knowing of the Egyptians, loved cats, and his men actually collected a bunch of cats prior to the battle and ordered them to simply walk up to the front gate. The Egyptians, under threat of death from their pharaoh, had no choice but to let Cambyses' men walk straight into the city unchecked. Cambyses' men then methodically slaughtered anyone who dared challenge them, using shields with cats to draw on them.
Number 5, King Henry VIII. The second wife of King Henry VIII. She was found guilty of treason, and she had been charged with having relationships with 5 others, including Lord Rochford, aka her brother, George Boleyn. She had also apparently had relations with Sir Henry Norris, the king's close friend, and when I say close, I mean they were really close. He was the groom of the stool. So they were close, and on top of this, Anne was also found guilty of conspiring to kill her husband. I wonder why. This list will explain a few reasons. Now, it's since been proven that these crimes were a bunch of rubbish. Anne wasn't present when these events even went down. She was still recovering from the birth of her daughter, future Elizabeth I, so there's no way she was fooling around with the groom of the stool in October 1533, Your Honor. All 5 guys involved were executed on Tower Hill May 1536, and then 2 days later, Anne joked about her own little neck before being taken out with the sword herself. Yeah, all dark. There wasn't even a coffin for her burial. Somebody had to get an old elm chest from the Tower Armory. How horrible is that? Number 4, a bit better. Another one of King Henry VIII's wives, Anne of Cleves. Where do we even begin here? This one's pretty sad, man. Anne was right in the middle of Henry's wives. She was married to King Henry for 6 months, and it was seen as quite strategic in a way. Henry's chief minister convinced him to marry one of the sisters of Germany's Duke of Cleves, either Anne or Amelia. So in order to decide, King Henry requested that Hans Holbein travel to Cleves to paint a portrait of each sister, and then come back and compare them. This is like the birth of Tinder. I'm not even joking, this is how he did it. This man compared portraits and then chose Anne because every man praiseth her beauty. Yeah, compared her to the silver moon. Yeah, try that on a dating site, write that in. I praiseth thou beauty, madam, to a silver dollar. A silver sea sand dollar shining in the moon. What? I don't know, just click it. Click send and see what happens. Then a treaty was signed. A few weeks later, Anne arrived to England, and Henry was beyond upset because she looked nothing like the portrait, apparently. How horrible is that? You look nothing like this Victorian painting. How dare you? It's 6 a.m. and you've been riding a horse for 4 weeks and you don't look like this Victorian painting? Shame. He tried to stop the wedding, but it was too late at that point, so they had to follow through. And on January 6, 1540, their marriage was official. You can't unswipe this marriage, rich boy. Anne later accepted the divorce gladly and then lived as the king's sister peacefully until her death in 1557. Number 3, Christian VII. Christian, there's an ironic name for what I'm about to tell you. The prince that couldn't keep his hands out of his pants. I don't know how else to say it. Here we go. Christian VII of Denmark. He was a young lad. He was spoiled. He was a little comfortable with his body, maybe too comfortable. And he would often just have his hands in his pants hanging out. He was like one of those, rich king. He was kind of like Joffrey from Game of Thrones. He would just sit back and like suck on candy and stuff and just, fool around. I don't know, it was gross. Middle of dinner, this guy would pass around food to his family with those gross hands. He would alternate hands and pants to handing out food. What a little twerp. Now it's unknown, but historians believe maybe, just maybe, he was a tad mad. Who's to tell? Either way, don't touch the rye bread, Christian. Thanks. Go wash your hands. Twice. Number 2, King Henry VIII. Again. Of course, we have to talk about Henry VIII again. He's pretty bad, not gonna lie. Henry VIII was King of England from 1509 to 1547. He's been married a handful of times, as we've heard by now, and all of them have went south. When Henry married Catherine, he was 49. She was a few years younger. She was actually a lot younger, classic 1500s. Way too young. And when they got married, Henry was not the same as he was when they had met. He had received a nasty jousting wound, so now he was gravely overweight. He didn't do anything. He just laid around all day and complained. So Catherine, of course, just wanted some, shred of a life, and being again quite young, too young, she decided to look for love. Well, God forbid you try and have a life in the 1500s, because then the young queen was accused of having an affair and was publicly and horribly taken out in the courtyard. And finally, coming in at number 1, Henry II. The relationship between Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine is pretty memorable. It's memorable in all the wrong ways, of course. When they first met, things were good, dare I say, with both of them. They were both young, and he was going to be king. He was young, king, guy, young man who's going to be king. And Eleanor, she was married, but once she got an annulment, their love was good. Their love was good and young and ready to be young king stuff. After the annulment in 1152, Henry and Eleanor tied the knot officially a couple weeks after. Love moves quickly, apparently. Henry started having affairs, because of course he did. At this point in this list, we're not gasping at affairs, sadly. But come 1173, Eleanor had convinced their sons to go against father. Yeah, Henry didn't take this well, and he had Eleanor locked up for 16 years. He had died, so after that point she had resumed the royal roles. because at this point those two boys had grown up and inherited the throne, Richard and John. But being locked up for that long, what a nightmare that relationship was entirely. I figured we'd end on a kind of tame one where she kind of came back and it was good. Kind of good, dare I say? I don't know.
Fatal herbs. Yingzig was born in China in 259 BC. Declared himself King Shi Huang, or the first emperor of the Qi dynasty, at age 38. He reportedly proclaimed that his dynasty would last 10,000 generations and wanted to be around long enough to see that prediction come true. Pretty difficult for the average human, especially in 259 BC, to live that long, so in order to make it happen, he needed to be immortal. According to the news agency Xinhua, 2017 analysis of 2,000-year-old texts dating to the emperor's rule shows his obsessive quest for an elixir that would bring him eternal life. A researcher discovered texts pertaining to an executive order issued by Qin Shi Huang demanding his subjects search for something that can keep him alive forever. He believed in an old myth that there were 3 spirit mountains in the sea inhabited by mortals. He used his soldiers to look for herbs and such that would grant him immortality and then drink them as elixirs. Unfortunately, Shi Huang did not find the correct elixir and passed away 11 years later at 49. Turns out a lot of these elixirs were often made by alchemists and had traces of mercury in them, which is suspected to have caused his demise. At number 9, body parts. In the 17th century, dead body parts called mummi were often sold to apothecaries and physicians. Why would they need body parts, you ask? Well, in those days, many believed that these parts contained some form of life force left over from the person, thus containing healing powers for medicine. When it came to royalty back then, living a long life was the goal, so in order to have the best chance at healing, royalty was often prescribed mumia, made of a healthy person or a young person. The medicine could be ingested by swallowing or rubbing it on an injury. So basically, royalty was paying for crushed up people so they could eat them or rub them into their skin. They had so much faith in mumia that it was believed to be able to treat serious ailments like coughs and epilepsy. Some of the royals who believed in the method were King Charles II and King William II of England, Francois I of France, Christian IV of Denmark. The medicine was in such high demand back then that some even took to digging up Egyptian graves and tomb robbing them for valuable bodies. The practice luckily died out in the 18th century. At number 8, lavish horse stable. Gaius Caesar Augustus Germasius, better known by his nickname Caligula, was the 3rd Roman emperor ruling from 37 to 41 AD. Caligula was described as an insane emperor who was self-absorbed and short-tempered, taking lives on a whim and indulging in too much spending and engaging in affairs. Apparently, he was accused of sleeping with other men's wives and then bragging about it and taking lives just for the fun of it. One thing Caligula did love was his horse Incitatus, who he would feed regular treats to and even paid for a stable to be made out of marble. Soldiers were even ordered to hush the neighborhood if the horse was asleep. Caligula also deliberately wasted money constructing a 2-mile floating bridge so that he and his horse could gallop along it. There was already a financial crisis going on, so the bridge money led to citizens starving. Probably the craziest idea he had was that he planned to appoint his horse to the high office of consul, but luckily for his people he was assassinated before he was able to do so. At number 7, dental tools. Peter the Great was the Tsar of Russia from 1682 until his passing in 1725. The ruler had his hobbies to pass his time, but one of the weirdest ones was amateur dentistry. Peter was fascinated by the practice, and by amateur I'm talking he actually had no idea what he was doing at all. Peter collected dental tools as well as people's teeth and a number of other peculiar items, including pickled lizards. Peter's private collection was known as his Chamber of Curiosities, and he would apparently collect the teeth from people that caught his attention. In fact, Peter loved pulling people's teeth so much that he would even remove his target's healthy teeth in the middle of his passion. I'm not sure what the tools or the process was like for pulling teeth back then, but I'd have to imagine you did not want to be chosen to be his next victim. His collection of teeth is still around along with the rest of his weird collection, but I think this is one that I don't need to see. At number 6, explicit collection. King Farouk was the 10th ruler of Egypt, lasting on the throne from April 1936 until July 1952. As king, he was known for his extravagant playboy lifestyle, and while initially popular, his reputation went down due to the corruption and incompetence of his government. He was deposed in 1952 and spent the remainder
remainder of his days exiled to Italy. In his hurry to get out of there and avoid the Mussolini treatment, the king left behind a majority of his prized possessions. Farouk was a kleptomaniac, and one of his hobbies was picking people's pockets. Along with his collection of stolen goods, the former king also had an extensive collection of explicit materials. The collection was so extensive that when the new government took over, they auctioned off his belongings, and was decided that he had accumulated the world's biggest collection of explicit images. People also discovered expensive suits, rare stamps and coins, luxury cars, but his collection of adult content had to be the most jarring to the people going through his things. It's hard to place a number on just how much material he had, but apparently Farouk's collection was too big to fit under a mattress. That being said, reportedly there was a photo album found under his pillow.
Number 5, big money. This is no surprise to anyone, I'm sure, but back in the day, I'd argue the division between wealth and poor was larger than today. Kings had it all. I mean, if you listen to what Taylor's saying, he knows what he's talking about. Food, water, power, what else is there? Well, how about the coinage to make it all happen? The bread, the guap, the dosh, and my favorite, the cheddar. Yes, that's right, the ancient king's wealth. Whatever they didn't already possess, they could take by force, or simply just bought with incalculable riches. With uncalculable riches. So much money. They had so much money. I can't make it clear. They had a lot of money. A great example of this was Mansa Musa, a very wealthy king from the Mali Empire. It's speculated he might have been the wealthiest person to ever walk the face of the earth. Earning his riches through the trading of gold and salt, he decided to show the international community how rich he was, and went on tour, because that's just something you do when you have millions of dollars, I guess. Where in multiple cities he spent and gave away so much gold that it upset the city's economies. That is a big flex. Okay. Donald Trump might have hotels, but Mansa Musa has everything else. It's kind of like Monopoly when one player has a boatload of cash and they go from one good property to the next. So even if they land on something, they got all the cold hard cash to deal with it. Plus they also have some good property and they just make it back every turn anyway. I'm fed up with Monopoly.
Number 4, king of castles. King Ludwig II had numerous castles built to resemble fairy tale castles. Yeah, let's call this inspiration, I guess. What a privilege this ought to be. Ludwig was only 18 when he became the king of Bavaria back in 1864, and then he had castles built as, you know, he was inspired from romantic literature and spending time at the opera. You hear that, Andrew? He was inspired after the opera. What a poet.
It's crazy.
Crazy. Must be nice, right? King Ludwig II would spend his nights in one castle, looking through his fancy telescope, admiring the next castle being built. He even freestyled the castle as well. Yeah, just 4 years in, the guy designed his own majestical castle. And to this day, it's one of the most photographed places in the world, so clearly he did something right. Neuschwanstein Castle, literal fairy tale, there we go. Meanwhile, I'm over here making castles in Minecraft. Still fun, we'll take it.
Number 3, jousting. First there is bread, and then there is wine, and then there is entertainment. You can't tell me while a delicious plate of nachos dances like a ballerina in your microwave, you didn't pull up some super cool content to watch on your phone. Maybe featuring a large, kinda funny comedian, and maybe also featuring a super handsome, tall, funny comedian with a neck thing, I don't know. Kings of ye olde times did not possess the power of the internet or watching fail videos, so watching combat sports was the next best thing. Oh, what's that I hear? Watching the sport isn't enough? Well, some royalty even got involved. King Henry VIII, for example, just loved to joust because he did. He even had an accident with such, and it's what might have made him gone mad in the first place.
Number 2, banning coffee. This is the worst of the worst, people. Here we go. Murad IV, Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, the guy banned coffee. What a monster. I would be asleep right now if coffee wasn't a thing. He was born in 1612, and for the most part his mother was ruling through him because he was so young and all. But when he got a little older, he got a little wiser, he put forth these laws, punishable by death, may I add, in order to get things back on track. That was the key. The guy banned coffee, tobacco, and alcohol. What a fun guy. He would actually disguise himself as a civilian at nighttime and then wander around aimlessly in hopes that he would find one of these dark roast renegades just wandering the roads. If you were caught outside having a quick smoke break, you weren't arrested, you didn't get fined, but rather Murad IV himself would just take off his hood and be like, surprise, and then he would take off your head. Right there in the streets. No trial, no jury, just straight to execution. All that for some stale ale. What a monster.
Number 1. Groom of the stool. For some reason this job was considered to be higher up, a well-respected job, if you will. However, I'd like to ask the man in charge of such an operation how he felt. I can imagine he wasn't too fond of his job. Hands never clean, hands never clean. The groom of the stool is someone who would assist the king in his bathroom duties by supplying fresh water, towels, and whatever a king needs. He may have also been responsible for cleaning the forbidden starfish. May the divines of Skyrim have mercy on his soul. I guess this had to be done, but I don't know if I could ever even do that to another human being. If you've ever eaten Taco Bell late at night and washed it down with some Baja Blast, then you know the kind of explosion awaits the porcelain throne in the morning. So yes, having a servant present at your bowel movements is a privilege that most other folks just didn't have, but would you really want one?
1. We gonna start with, why are you so stingy? You literally live in a castle. You have gold doubloons like an effing pirate, priceless spices stolen from foreign lands, and gemstones harvested fresh from the earth. But you're gonna have us measure every loaf of bread so they're the exact same? Back in the late 1500s, Viscount Montagu demanded meticulous records of every expenditure. The clerk of the kitchen was a crossbreed between an extreme couponer and a professional nitpicker, who had to provide the cooks with the ingredients for every meal in exact amounts for each person to be served, and ensure that each plate had the exact same weight and proportions laid upon it. Among his many duties was also to ensure every wheat loaf that went in the oven weighed 18 ounces and was 16 ounces when it was taken out. What happens if they weighed more or less? Off to the bread breaking wheel, or maybe the sourdough slow slicer, off to the steak for a little French toasting, Anyway, for how the British monarchy would pitch a fit over a 3-letter word, children, not kids, because we all want to speak a little bit more like Mary Poppins. Oh yes, little children, off to bed we go. Nah, dude, I couldn't do the whole royal nanny thing, to be honest. The education required enough makes you think that they're scouting for NASA, not someone to stop their kid from picking its nose, publicly at least. Maria Borello, the nanny who takes care of Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis, trained at the notable Norland College in Bath, England, before being hired to the world's most famous children. At this college, students like Borello study early years development for 3 years. However, as well as learning social and emotional development, students are also taught the importance of vocabulary. There is one word that royal nannies are prohibited from using to describe royal children: kids. Ask me why. Come on. Ask me. It's because of the exact honky-dory dumbass reason you think. It's the baby goat thing. Kids is a name for them and an informal name for children, because who says that it's not the Victorian era? According to Heron, the word kid is disrespectful and dissuades royal children from being seen as individuals. You mean like how sheltering them and not allowing them everyday friends or normal reality or exposure to the real world under the guise of safety, but it's more so they grow up in a bubble of unrealistic world perspective and can't understand problems morally and empathetically as an adult, only in a political sense. You mean like that? Sounds like what they're doing. And speaking of the Windsors, did y'all know Charles specifically sucks? A lot of kings imposed a lot of rules for their servants, but something about King Charles gets the most under the skin. Maybe it's because he had some pretty frivolous, unrealistic asks for a man who just got the throne this year. So listen to his tea procedure alone. Charles is very particular for how his tea is served when he's visiting the Paladinian house. When preparing the tea, you must use a teaspoon measurement of tea leaves per cup, and then there must be an exact temperature of 7 degrees Celsius for green tea and 100 degrees Celsius for Earl Grey or English breakfast. The prince's hot beverage must also be checked with a thermometer before being served, and honey should always be used to sweeten the tea rather than sugar. When serving the tea to the prince, the teaspoon should be situated precisely to the right underneath of the handle of the cup. Clive Goodman, a royal reporter for News of the World, claimed that Prince Charles does nothing himself. He described the morning scene in which Charles gets ready for the day, but all the preparation is done for him. He gets up in the morning, his bathrobe is there waiting for him. He walks into the bathroom, the bath is drawn for him already. Even when he gets out of the bath, the towel is already folded in a special way, so he just has to sit in it and wrap it around himself. Then he goes into the dressing room, his clothes are laid out for him, even his socks, left and right, are in the exact right spot. Charles even has valets squeeze 1 inch of toothpaste onto his toothbrush every morning. If anyone gets anything wrong, everyone is scolded. Gosh, and I'm sure y'all remember the viral video of him from September of 2022 for forcing a servant to come clear off the desk of like 3 pieces of paper because he couldn't have done it himself. Since that highly debated viral clip was mentioned, I'll make the next point about how gratitude is implied, which it's most definitely not. I don't see a lot of gratitude coming from royal families. There is endless videos and pictures of these sour-faced monarchs harassing and devaluing the endless service they have accompanying them. Let me hit y'all with an iconic example. Have you seen Downton Abbey? Most folks have. Have you ever noticed one of their royal or aristocratic characters ever say thank you to their servants? No? And that's an intentional detail, as it's been a long since unspoken, at least in British monarchy, that servants are best unthanked and unheard. Now, Alistair Bruce in the BTS documentary about the TV show series explained his perspective, that the servants did everything for their masters, and if thanks were given, it would be necessary to say them at least 60 times a day. That would be, as the English say, tiresome. It does stand that servants are not required to be thanked no matter if they just tied your shoe or wipe your ass. You as a royal have the right to just scoff and point and expect results. But at least one royal who can't verbally berate you is the revered royal pets. Multiple royal houses and their respective rulers have decided to use these rules and servants to treat their pets as an extension of themselves. By personifying them, even just trimming a corgi's nails too short could get you proverbially beheaded and definitively fired. Some famous examples of royals who have servants service their pets are Queen Elizabeth II staged a funeral for a chameleon, and an Indian ruler Muhammad Mahaba Khan threw a lavish elaborate wedding for his dog. Louis of France took being a cat person to a whole other level and basically turned Versailles into a giant breeding ground. Charles II of England issued a royal law that his iconic King Charles Spaniels, which are obviously named after him, have license to walk anywhere in the kingdom without harassment, even Parliament. And of course, who can forget Caligula, who appointed his favorite horse, Icarus, as an official senator.
Hey, number 5, Pedro of Castile. Pedro of Castile was doing as the European monarchs do. Sometimes you gotta marry for alliances. Sure, it makes sense. Your kingdom is much less likely to get steamrolled by a larger kingdom if you have an alliance with fellow kingdoms, or the bigger kingdom itself, actually. Pedro of Castile married the young Blanche of Bourbon of France, and so Spain could just be a wee bit more snug, in case the English come over. You gotta be careful. But Pedro just wasn't having it. What he was having instead was a mistress named Maria. So instead of enduring a loveless marriage, he had poor Blanche locked away in a tower, just like Sleeping Beauty. Except a handsome prince was not coming to rescue this damsel in distress, but a man with a black hood and a sharpened axe. You know what I'm talking about. As Pedro had her unalived. I was gonna make a joke about Rapunzel and let down some hair so she could make an escape, but I mean that's just awful, really. Imagine being locked up in a tower for so long. Sure, I love the indoors, but you gotta let me out at some point, Chief. Do you think I get food delivery apps to work up in a tower? Because otherwise you have to let me out, dude. Comic-Con's coming. Anime Convention North's coming, buddy. I gotta go. Gotta get my Naruto on, bro. Come on, man. Number 4, hands-on funeral. This one's just gross. When you're in a relationship, it can provide you with some great things. Someone to go through life with. Companionship, love, and if you're lucky, someone who's a good cook or a baker. Oh, love me some baked goods. However, also in a relationship, sometimes you do more than that. Sometimes you get a little close under the sheets, if you know what I'm saying. Take King Philip V, for an example, who loved loving his wife so much that he just couldn't help himself, you know? Like for instance, when his wife tragically passed away, he wanted one last ride. But he penciled in one more trip to Toe Curl City before she was laid to rest. God, that doesn't seem right, you know? That just let her go peacefully, you know? Let her just. Number 3, Lenin. Okay, while not a king in the most stereotypical sense, he did dethrone a king and made himself an autocratic dictator, which is basically a king just modern. Trust me, it is. Yep, trust me. In a nutshell, Lenin had been anti-royal for most of his life, but after some help from some sneaky Germans and other Soviets loyal to his cause, the Tsar had no choice but to abdicate, like I said at the top of the list. He abolished the Tsar's secret police and then put in his own. And had people oppressed, which was one of the main reasons why the whole revolution started in the first place. See what I'm getting at? He was supposed to get rid of the evil monarch, and he became the evil monarch. Well, see, then a civil war broke out, and then he was worried that the exiled Tsar might escape and try to retake the throne, and, well, he had some goons take care of him, and, well, the family too. You can never be too sure. You gotta take care of everything. You gotta get rid of everybody. You just can't be too sure. Number 2, Pope John XII. For those who aren't very religious like myself, the Pope is the big one. He's next to God, and for a minute there, he was the most powerful man on earth. Seriously, I mean, this guy could crown kings. He's the king of the Vatican and the king of kings in the Holy Scripture. It's kind of serious. And today he's got a really cool car for parades. The Bumblebee is pretty sick, not gonna lie. However, Pope John XII was anything but a sweet old man who delivers the holy messages from God. This Pope was doing a lot of anti-Pope behavior, if you will. Now I for one wouldn't care if the man had a girlfriend or a glass of wine. Heck, some rules need to be changed, but this Pope was most known for his lavish, how you say, adult-themed parties, and was known for getting hangovers. It got so bad at one point, it started a war. Number 1, not so slick shady. Marshall Mathers, Eminem, the king of rap, and named king of hip hop by Rolling Stones magazine. Hence he's a king, I gotcha. Despite what you think of the man's lyrics, especially vulgarity, he's an excellent wordsmith and could write rhymes that would leave you tongue twisted. However, I don't think it would come to anyone's surprise that the man's got a few charges under his belt, especially the way he talks about Kim. There's a couple bad things said about her, I don't know. Back in 2001, arguably the peak of his career, Eminem assaulted somebody in a nightclub after getting fresh with his wife. He got 2 years probation. Maybe he is saying the things he's saying in those songs. Maybe he's telling the truth. I don't know. Number 10, King Midas. Most people know the story of King Midas, but in a nutshell, he was a king who was granted the power of everything he touched turned to solid gold. So, no, he didn't exactly buy anything with that kind of power, but the man can have anything he wants or buy anything he wants. It's a lot of gold. This sounds great, but it's really awful for a couple of reasons. One, that is pretty much the moral of the story, and the other is, well, some basic economy stuff. The first reason this would suck is that, one, you should never be too greedy, and you really shouldn't. And you should always be careful what you wish for. This blessing quickly turned into a curse as Midas could no longer eat. Which, that's bad. Not eating and everything you touch turned to gold. Ugh, you couldn't hug anybody, it's terrible. The other issue would be his wealth. You'd have to be very careful on how many items you actually touched, as producing too much gold would eventually devalue the price of gold. Especially if you touch a bed or something, that's a lot of gold. Imagine how much a solid gold bed would weigh, or how much that would be worth. So in reality, you would be both starving and poor. Number 9, Mansa Musa. Sort of related to the King Midas issue, Mansa Musa was probably the richest man to ever walk the face of the earth. A king from northern Africa who exploited his country's salt and gold reserves. His estimated wealth today would be around the $400 billion mark. $400 billion US. Ooh, that's a lot of money. Tough to actually measure it exactly because it was from so long ago, but it could be less, and some say it could actually even be more. Mansa Musa went on tour one year to see all the beautiful things he could of the ancient world, and you can't take a little vacation without buying something at the gift shop. Mansa Musa was so rich and spent so much money in a few towns that he visited that he single-handedly upset the economy of those cities. Elon Musk wishes he could. So he basically bought a lot of stuff, and it was unusual because it upset the economy. Like, he destroyed the economy of those towns. That's insane. Number 8, Michael Jackson, the king of pop. See, I got you. I pulled a sneaky on you. But he's still a king. And maybe he was the biggest celebrity who ever lived. Would Halloween really be Halloween without Thriller? And how could cool guys let you know they were cool in the 80s if they didn't have all that leather jacket stuff? You wouldn't be able to know. You just wouldn't. Well, maybe some things you don't know about Michael Jackson were his shopping habits. The man loved shopping. And with that kind of money, well, you can do anything. Well, some may remember his chimp, his Neverland mansion complete with carnival rides, an arcade, and even an oxygen chamber in case Darth Vader was coming over to stay the night. However, something very strange the man tried to do was he tried to buy a very strange man himself, or rather his bones. For some reason, Michael had a fascination with the Elephant Man, a man with severe facial deformities and freak show performer from the late 1800s. Michael tried to purchase his remains. That's it. That's the point. He tried to buy him. They wouldn't let him, but he tried. That's a weird thing to buy. Whenever I hit the number, I don't go, hey, 1-800 museum people, someone bring me King Tut. I want it. Number 7, Elvis Presley. Lots of similarities today. Elvis Presley, before Michael Jackson, he was probably the most famous person to ever exist. The king of rock and roll, baby, that's right. All I'll say is phone your grandma and ask her how she feels about him. She probably says she loves his music and those gyrating hips. At the time, it was pretty controversial. Boy, only if they knew what was going on today. Whew. Sorry, 50s atomic families. Well, being that Elvis Presley was the king and the first celebrity to be idolized the way we do with modern celebrities, he became quite wealthy. Well, with all that money, he bought some weird things, including a chimp. Everyone's buying a monkey, they want a zoo, I don't know. A mansion property he named Graceland, a pink Cadillac for his mother, and strangely enough, he bought FDR's yacht. Yeah, what? That's so weird. Good president, sure, but does it really have room for a monkey in a pink Cadillac? I don't know. Number 6, French royalty. This one is more about Marie Antoinette and King Louis XVI. It's kind of like a two-pack, kind of like a couple, but trust me, it all makes sense in the end. Again, anything they bought, it was probably the king's wallet, wasn't it? Okay, so when your country is starving, demanding more rights, and in general, life really sucks, what's the next best thing you do? Buy a $12 million necklace. Yeah, right, okay, I've said that before, sure. Okay, Chad, what else? Continue to live your opulent life on the king's and people's dimes. Sure, why not? It makes sense, okay. I'm talking too much. Well, something I learned today and something that Taylor showed me is that I guess the last queen of France was a little lonely. So what did King Louis do to fix this? Spend more time with her? Nay. Buy her a new dog? Nay, sir and madams. He had her pug from Austria imported to the country. And anyone can tell you that when something is imported, you are going to be dishing out a few more dosh. Yes, that's right. They imported her pug from Austria. Imagine how that sounds when your house is literally falling apart, you're starving, and you pay the most taxes. Makes you want to put heads on pikes. That's what it makes you want to do. Can you imagine that? We're all poor and hungry. She's like, well, look at my dog. It's my dog. They're French. They don't sound like that, but this is my dog. Look at my dog. Here he is. Number 5, Ferdinand I of Naples. This one is so strange. I can't even. I have to mention. I cannot not say it. In a nutshell, Ferdinand looked normal, just your average European king. I mean, what could be wrong about this guy, right? He looks pretty normal. Well, the guy was basically Buffalo Bill. Ferdinand liked to keep his enemies close, taking after a little bit of Michael Corleone. However, so close that oftentimes dinner guests would mysteriously disappear and end up not breathing. Afterwards, they would be mummified and pickled and dressed as if they were still alive. He would then invite more guests over for dinner to show them what could happen if they crossed him. He would open the doors and show them a sick dinner-esque area play thing of people dressed up, and that's what bad people do. That's what Buffalo Bill would do. That's gross. We don't like that. Number 4, Henry VIII. Are you even surprised he's on this list? I mean, come on, it's Henry VIII. But I support all healthy marriages, and I support healthy divorces. Sometimes things just don't work out, but that doesn't mean you have to go all Johnny Depp on the situation. There's better ways to work things out. Well, in Henry's case, it may not be televised on national TV, or global TV in this case. It was more like Edward Scissorhands, if you will. Henry VIII is famous for dealing with his wives. When the church would not grant him the divorce he so wished for, he removed his wife's head from her body. And then he remarried and divorced another, and then another one lost her head and then divorced another, and then finally he passed away and the wife lived on. It makes sense, sure, that's... All I'm saying is the man went a little too far, that's all I'm saying, just a little bit. Number 3, John, King of England. This is the dude who wrote the Magna Carta, which for legal students everywhere is like planet Krypton. It's where it all starts, the whole Superman, the law, everything. It's the basis of everything. Besides Hammurabi's Code, of course. Well, it's not like he signed it very enthusiastically, and the man really wasn't the nicest. He's also known for taking 22 of his most noble knights and throwing them away in a dungeon until they starved and didn't wake up for, well, no breakfast. He betrayed his brother, Richard the Lionheart, the very famous Richard the Lionheart, who also wasn't very nice either, and is suspected of being the mastermind behind the de-lifing of his nephew. Ooh, talk about family scandal. Number 2, Napoleon Bonaparte. I know, hear me out though. The story of France and Napoleon is one for the history books. I mean, really, it's so strange. Imagine a country that violently overthrows its king and queen, and then while in the middle of that, which could be described as the worst political strife in history, you then go to war, which, if you know how that, it's not a good idea. You're probably gonna lose. Except Napoleon didn't lose. Napoleon took France to war like 5 times within a short time period and won most of them. It's pretty good. Well, good for winning, not good for the people that didn't make it. That's when he declared himself Emperor of France and kind of lost his way, which it's stupid because it defeated the whole purpose and point of the revolution and the democracy that the people were so fighting for. Eventually, the international community caught up with him and banned him to an island. twice. Because he came back and said, I'm back, and then, no, back to the island. Go back, you're going back. Number 1, Elvis Presley. Look, I know, it's Elvis, but he's the king of rock and roll, man. You can't go wrong with Elvis. Plus, it kind of works too, because I think people have a really good image of him, but he actually wasn't. You'll see. He is the king of rock and roll, to be fair, and he's more famous than any king on this list, actually. But the king of rock and roll isn't so squeaky clean, and certainly not a stranger to crime and scandal. At some points in his career, you could find him excessive drinking and using illicit substances, if you will. He might have had to put on those jailhouse rocking denims, well, for real. Back in 1956, at the peak of his fame, really, Elvis got into a physical altercation with 2 gas station attendants after fans began to crowd him. It was a messy situation, and he was actually up on charges of battery and disorderly conduct. Not a good look for the king, baby. The king's gotta stay clean.
Kicking off the list at number 10, a fool. While ancient kings have all the riches one man can possibly have, it's still somehow never enough. Kings also have their own walking, talking party. Yeah, how fun is that? The earliest accounts of the fool go back to the 11th century. These fools were hired to liven up the party. Most of you may have an image of a jester in your head, just jumping around on tables, telling jokes, juggling with big pointy shoes, wearing pajamas. Yeah, that's pretty accurate. It was pretty fun. One of the best jobs to have was the title of a minstrel, or a fool. It was an honor to have, really, and the fool's payment was no joke. Roland Le Picheur was rewarded with 30 acres of land from King Henry II, as long as he showed up to court every year on Christmas Day to fart. Literally, he would show up and fart around. But these fools also held responsibility in their silly little lips. Fools needed to find the balance of humor and wit. It was harder back then than anything. Many of these jesters were given the role of advisor to the king and queen. The phrase, "don't shoot the messenger," this is where it comes from. The jester would have to tell them horrible news, but in a fun, positive way. For example, back in 1340, King Philip IV, his fleet was destroyed in naval battle, the British completely wiped them out, and it was an otherwise devastating loss, but the jester, the fool, brought this news in a light way. He said to the king, "They don't even have the guts to jump into the water like our brave French do." And then he farted and disappeared.
Number 9, access to clean water. Today in a modern world, there are things that we just can't live without. A vape pen, Starbucks, and that weird looking back massager that everyone says they bought for their backs, but it's actually for their undercarriage. Speaking of undercarriages, you don't want to drink from the water from underneath one. Dirty, muddy street water is bad for your health. The ancient kings of old knew this. It was common knowledge that drinking dirty water could lead to you spending more time squatting over a hole than spending time with your family, and nobody wants that. Life for citizens who were not royals could have it pretty rough. Ancient kings had the luxury of having clean water, or somewhat, it's still kinda not so clean, or at least more clean than the commoners. Through methods of fresh spring water, boiling, and even some early filtration methods, they had access to better water that wouldn't make their guts hurt. With that being said, a lot of times, given the sussy nature of water, a lot of kings just drank alcohol, which honestly might have saved them since the alcohol could possibly kill harmful bacteria. It's the one time in life that boozing might save your life. Anyone got a beer?
Number 8, ladies first. These ancient kings, they could literally do whatever they wanted. And it's important to note how they would act if they didn't get what they wanted, right? Like George IV of England, he's referred to as England's worst king by historians. Great title, even worse than King Joffrey, what do you know? It's one thing to spiral into debt, that's classic king behavior. MC Hammer went broke, we get it, it happens. But George IV, he was all about the ladies, a little bit too much. All he wanted in life was just to hook up with women, that was it, his only desire in life. And if they weren't interested, George was known to throw fits. He would cry and stomp his feet, literally. You know how those brave and bold kings do? George would offer these ladies money, although they weren't for sale, so that wasn't a great plan and didn't work a lot of the time. And George would go so far to threaten his own well-being if they refused. How terrible is that guy, right? Just imagine that conversation, how insane. What takes this to the absolute next level though is that George would keep a lock of his partner's hair after they had spent the night together. Now I know you're freaking out, maybe you're like, huh? Maybe you just choked on your rye bread sandwich a bit, that's more than fair. At the time, this wasn't abnormal behavior. I mean, you know, lovers would exchange their hair instead of phone numbers, I get it, it's back in the old days. But George, he had a lot of hair. He had like a lot of hair. He had like 7,000 envelopes filled with hair. I'm over here exchanging phone numbers at the club. Like, what am I doing wrong? Am I, doink? Call me, peace.
Number 7, food. Nice. Whether you like it or not, at some point in your life you're gonna have to eat, and if you're like me, that means all the time. Steaks, ribs, beer, Burger King, pizza, pasta, ham, and chicken wings. Nice! It should be no surprise that I like beer and barbecue, and to answer your question, yes, I am the most fun guy to be around at the barbecue. Why? I just like to have fun and I like to eat good food, man. That's just it. Imagine a world, however, where there is no pizza and chicken wings. I know, it's horrible, right? Ugh. Food was always a concern of commoners in ancient times, and as much as I love meat, it wasn't always available. They just didn't live in the industrial agricultural world that we live in today. For Romans, it was a steady diet of breads and nuts, and if they were lucky, maybe some cheese or soup. But for the kings and emperors of old, well, if you feel like vomiting after all you can eat buffets, it makes you feel, some first world kind of guilt, then look no further than ancient kings. Food might be the most excessive way they live, really. All kinds of meats all the time, beer, wine, fresh fruit and vegetables, which for health reasons is pretty huge, and to make them huge, maybe even some desserts. The Egyptians, for example, were known for their sweets. And now I'm hungry. We should go to a banquet together.
Number 6. 6,000 knights. Being a medieval knight, obviously, it sounds cool. They have the sword, the horse, the flowing hair, all that good stuff. They're saving the damsel in distress in some sort of tower. Well, no, it actually sucked being a knight at all. First of all, chainmail. You know how heavy chainmail is alone by itself? It's like 55 pounds. All that chainmail underneath your armor, no way. My body, this Q-tip spine would just break in half. No way. I can't even get on a horse wearing jeans and a shirt, let alone chainmail. Being a knight is something that starts when you're 7 years old as well. You gotta start as a little tot, little royal tot. Then you'd be given to a noble to learn and be wise for 7 years, some, Yoda type scenario. And then at age 14, you become a squire. A knight's intern, not an ideal job to have when you're 14, but if you stick it out just 7 more years, then you're an official knight. That's it. But then what? Do kings have 2 knights? Do they have 4 each? Is it like a breakdance squad? Is it like 8s, groups of 8s? Like, how do we do this? Henry II of England could call up to 6,000 knights. This was back in the late 12th century. That's a lot of backup. That's a lot of shiny, majestical backup. My favorite knight, still to this day, I don't care, Martin Lawrence.
Jamal, Scott, Walker.
FBI, what's up? What's happening, y'all?
In our number 5 spot today, we have Nero. For this one, we are going to be taking it all the way back to the age of the Roman Empire. When we think back to these times, they weren't necessarily the most kind, peaceful times, but there certainly are some characters that stand out as being particularly brutal, and one of those is Nero. Throughout his reign, he wreaked havoc on the Roman Empire. He burned cities, he killed thousands of people, including every member of his own family, and I mean, we know the inventive execution methods of the past, so you can probably guess at just how brutal all of these were. Most Roman sources give us an almost completely negative review of him in reference to both his personality as well as his reign as a leader. He was called compulsive and corrupt, and it is believed that he is actually to blame for the great fire that burned Rome, but instead he used the Christians as a scapegoat so that they would receive punishments rather than him. In the end, after being declared a public enemy by the Roman Senate and realizing that the rebellion would be lost, he ended up taking his own life at the age of 30. In our number 4 spot today, we have Pol Pot. Pol Pot was the leader of the Cambodian revolutionary group called the Khmer Rouge, and this group, with him at the forefront, went on to try and destroy the Cambodian civilization. This wasn't necessarily how the group started out, but once Paul and others who shared his ideals came to lead it, things quickly became very dark. He is likely one of the only people who ordered a mass genocide in his own country. The reasoning behind all of this is because he believed that destroying the civilization was the best way to start a new regime and bring in a new age. He ended up serving as the prime minister from 1976 until 1979, during which his policies led to the deaths of around 2 million people, which is horrifying. That was about 25% of the entire population. He even liked to keep the skulls of those he had killed. Just gonna say, it seems as though politics was the mask for someone who just really wanted to kill people. There are so many horrific details surrounding him and the things he did, much of which I can't even repeat here on YouTube, and that is exactly how he landed a spot here on today's list. He truly did some horrendous things, and in the end went on to live the rest of his life and died of natural causes before he could even answer for any of his crimes, which is just the most frustrating end to a horrible tale. In our number 3 spot today, we have Maximilian Robespierre. Robespierre. Okay, I'll be honest. This is quite a polarizing one. Maximilian, on one hand, was great. He advocated for universal suffrage, for unrestricted admission to national posts, and he was against racial and religious discrimination. Especially in the time he ruled in, this was huge. Of course people were against him, but in our modern views, he was way ahead of his time in these beliefs. On the other hand, however, he was extremely violent and was the leader during most of the French reign of terror that happened during the Revolution. It is said that during this time he was responsible for imprisoning somewhere around 300,000 and killing somewhere around 40,000. During the Revolution in 1793, he was elected head of the Committee of Public Safety, and from that point on, any voice that was in opposition to the change that was happening was struck down and silenced by him. Throughout the years, his ego and power only grew, which led to him being a little too quick to use the guillotine, his favorite execution method. He was getting a little too cozy with that thing, so much so that he began to use it even on people who had, at one time, been his allies. We saw this clearly when it came to the execution of George Danton, who Maximilian had executed after he suggested maybe chilling out on the whole reign of terror thing. In the end, people caught on to this tendency for violence and horrible punishments, which definitely lost some of his public support, and this was only exacerbated when it was realized that he now had beliefs that directly contradicted those he had earlier, like when he tried to create a national religion called the Cult of the Supreme Being. By the time 1794 came around, he was overthrown, and later that year he found himself being executed by, you guessed it, the guillotine. Not good. No thanks. In our number 2 spot today we have Vlad Tepes. Often referred to as Vlad the Impaler, he was the ruler of Wallachia 3 times between 1448 until his death in 1476. He is often regarded as one of the most important rulers in Wallachian history, and to many he is a hero, and this is not to disregard that. But you don't get a nickname like the Impaler by being a passive, peaceful guy. Vlad was known for his brutality and his love of impaling people, but it is also said that everyone's favorite vampire, Dracula, was modeled after him. This is because it is rumored that Vlad liked to dip his bread in the blood of his enemies before eating it. I prefer a little olive oil and balsamic vinegar with mine, but hey, to each his own, I guess. Vlad is known for his intimidation tactics, which included having bodies of those he had killed lined up outside of the city so that any enemies approaching would know what fate they had coming. Like I mentioned before, many regard Vlad as a hero. I mean, it is abundantly clear that he fought as hard as he could to protect Romania and Bulgaria from the Ottomans, but that doesn't mean that the horrific things he did have been forgotten either. Vlad definitely left quite the legacy behind when he was killed in 1476. In our number 1 spot today we have Joseph Stalin. Stalin was a Georgian revolutionary and Soviet political leader who governed the Soviet Union from 1922 until his death in 1953. Despite the fact that he started his time governing the country as a part of a collective leadership, by the 1930s he had consolidated all of the power and went on to begin acting as the Soviet Union's dictator. During his reign, Stalin was responsible for the deaths of over 60 million people, 20 million of them being his own. Apparently the math works out to about 40,000 people per week, which is just unbelievable. For almost 30 years he reigned the Soviet Union with terror and violence. I mean, his decisions led to a famine that killed millions of people. Also, the lives he took weren't just of his enemies. I mean, how could one person have 60 million enemies? He would take the lives of families of people he liked. He just took too many lives, was too paranoid, and while he was powerful and smart, he could also be an absolute monster. This is all perfectly summed up when he said, quote, "One death is a tragedy, a million deaths is simply a statistic."
Kicking off the list at number 10, a goodnight kiss. We'll start off funny, okay? History can be funny sometimes, even when it's not meant to be, and it's meant to be completely serious. I can't help but read this information and laugh. Royals were sweating constantly about people trying to take them out, of course. I mentioned Boy Jones on here a few times. That guy stalked the Queen over and over for years. Historically, these royals have been on the lookout for enemies, and the way that they prevent these attacks, yeah, sometimes it can be a little funny. Like the kissing sheets, for example. Have you heard about this weird position in the castle? What an odd job this is. A great deal of monarchs hired taste testers to make sure nobody poisoned their ale, which is, pretty lousy job there. Either having a good day or a bad day, no in between. But they also had a guy kiss the king's sheets every day, just He just kissed the entire bed. The king size, may I remind you, massive bed. King Henry VIII, this guy hired somebody to literally just go in, get snuggled up, and just make sure the king's bed wasn't poisoned. There's nothing on it that's gonna make the skin go all ouchy. But he would just get in his bed and just go to sleep for a bit. You are required to make the king's bed every morning, of course, and before he gets back in, you gotta get in and kiss that bed, man. You gotta kiss that bed real good. Mwah, mwah, let's go. Mwah. All right, time to clock out for the day. Mwah, one more for good luck. Clothes as well, that was touched. Maybe not kissed, but it was for sure worn and touched. It's so weird. Guys wearing my clothes in my bed. No way, I'd rather get poisoned. Like, yo, take my jeans off. Who is that guy? Get back here. Like, imagine marrying that king and it's like, oh, hang on, before we get snugged in, this guy has to go and kiss your sheets. She's like, ew, what? Why does my sheets smell like breath? Everything smells like breath. Number 9, enemas. We gotta talk about perhaps one of the worst sights to see in the household. Back in the olden days, enemas were the talk of the town. Well, rather, the palace. Like most things in the 1400s, only the rich could afford the enema supplies. Specifically, King Louis XIV. Guy loved enemas. Just big old fan of enemas. It's believed that over the course of his life, Louis XIV received thousands of enemas. Thousands. It's a lot of decimals. Decimals for enemas. In just 1 year, Louis received 212 enemas. Like, guy, that's like 112 too much, I'd say. I don't know. He would always take it a step further, and dare I say, a step fancier, by using almond milk for the enemas. Imagine being married to a guy and he pulls out almond milk and you're like, oh no, not again, come on, Louis, please, I just ate. Number 8, no bathing in this house. Bathing in the olden days wasn't fully understood, if that makes any sense. Like in a medical book, in an official 16th century medical book, the medical advice was, use not baths or stews, nor sweat too much, for all openeth the pores of a man's body, and maketh the venomous air to enter and for to infect the blood. First of all, huh? What? What does it even mean? Why is every shred of medical knowledge always written in riddles? God forbid you have bronchitis in the 16th century. A doctor would just be like, ah yes, just a drop of ale and a witch's flick and you'll be on your way. Like, what? Do you have any halls? Help me. Help me, dude. No, I'm just mad. I just like, bro, I have pneumonia. I need medicine. So of course they thought that taking a bath would make you sick. Of course. So King James IV, apparently this guy never took a bath in his life. And his hygiene was so bad that he would sometimes pass lice to others just by being in the same room that he was earlier. So not at the same time, he would come in, do his king stuff, leave, and the lice would be like, pew! And they would just wait in that room and get on someone else. That's so gross. That's horrible. Lice would emit off this man. He's like the stinky kid from Charlie Brown with the stinky cloud. That's just like lice around this guy. Margaret Tudor was married to King James. Yeah, must have loved the no bathing thing, eh? Oh boy. Number 7, Queen Caroline. Queen Caroline. Ba ba ba. She went out in a horrible way. We can't sing about her. History remembers Queen Caroline for the way that she went out. It was bad. It was actually written down in an epigram attributed to the 18th century poet Alexander Pope. Here lies wrapped up in 40,000 towels, the only proof that Caroline had bowels. Again, it rhymes. Why is everything rhyming? This is so awful. Who can be like, yeah, write that down, that's good, that's good. Wait. It does rhyme, that's good, that checks out. Rest in peace. My gosh, her husband, he was certainly no help at all. Caroline was previously married to George IV, and this guy locked her out of Westminster on Coronation Day. So yeah, she went out in a horrible way, but let's not forget the marriage that came beforehand. That wasn't pleasant either. Nothing in this guy or this marriage was pleasant. Number 6, Henry VIII. Of course he's back. He had 6 wives and it was pretty much entirely bad for all of them, yeah. It was the late 1400s. Henry took the throne in 1509. This guy was only 17 years old when all of this madness began to unfold. Only days after the execution of Anne, who I mentioned on part 1 of this list, so days after he married his 3rd wife, Jane Seymour. Anne Boleyn and Jane Seymour's mothers were first cousins, so they were close, and during all of this, they of course went head to head more than once. Jane died shortly after giving birth to Edward VI on October 12, 1537. I can't mention King Henry's wives and leave a couple out. This is just a history channel. We have to mention all of them, okay?
But I'd have to say, I imagine there's not much worse than food tasting. Normally, you'd be able to think this wouldn't be so bad. Wrong, let me make it worse. So obviously, they're tasting it for poison and other tricky little substances that could be take down a king? What if the soup was laced with arsenic? How easy is it to slip into the kitchen and lace the king's food with belladonna or hemlock? The food tester was always a servant, or sometimes even a slave or a prisoner, and if you think about those status of those people, well, they were eating mush flour and bone broth and then calling it a day. Given the opportunity to be a food taster means the literal taste of luxury. The only effed part is the first bite of flavorful rice you're ever going to eat in your life, you're going to immediately die. Maybe. It'd be enough for you to put off eating any meal you didn't prepare yourself, and there'd be no way of knowing if the food was deadly until after you've eaten it. In 1594, there was a plot to poison Queen Elizabeth, apparently the King of Spain, as the Spanish were enemies of England at the time. A group of Portuguese men had agreed to carry out the dirty work, including the Queen's own physician Rodrigo Lopez. Once the plot was uncovered, all men were executed. And it's not just our ancient royals that brought people on to do this task. Naturally, President Putin has a food taster as part of his security team. No hoovering, which is British for don't vacuum. In 2011, Royal Servants was uploaded to YouTube, a documentary that gave insight into what it's like working for the royal family, including accounts from former butlers, chefs, nannies, and footmen. To quote the narrator, the best servant is one that is neither seen nor heard. The royal family demands the most professional servants in the world, the kind of servants that would rather die than make a mistake. She continues on in this not pretentious at all breakdown, saying that behind the scenes, butlers lay out clothes, footmen carry early morning trays, and cleaners sweep carpets, lest royal ears are offended by vacuum cleaners. One rule cleaners must follow is that they have to sweep the floors instead of hoovering them, because the sound may be too loud, especially in the early morning. I don't know if you guys have seen these palaces, but they're about 110% red carpet, and it's not that cheap kind. This stuff probably holds on to dirt the way your homie holds on to their cheating ex. Not being permitted to use such modern inventions makes their job not even a little, but a lot more difficult. Immensely. They have to quite literally sweep the carpets, the most ineffective way to clean a carpet that's tacked into the ground. And they're already being held at a higher standard than really any other servant on earth. But don't forget, after you're done measuring the carrots, you feed the horses, and sweeping a carpet, you also have to kiss the linens. Whichever unfortunate servant was tasked with making Henry VIII's bed after he woke up in the morning was then required to kiss every part of the linen to prove he hadn't smeared poison on them. What? Don't get me wrong, Henry was like intensely and increasingly paranoid. You can go check my recent video, Top 10 King Henry VIII Facts You Never Knew, to learn more about his whole mess. But anyways, someone screws the pooch. Pretty sure it's Ambroise Parche, the 16th century French royal physician, who once wrote, "Now poisons do not only kill being taken into the body, but some being put or applied outwardly." And now this delusional hypochondriac finds out the poison can sink in through his skin, not just be ingested, and he insists on this gross ritual. In an era where sheets don't get washed, and he doesn't wash, and he's all sweaty and gouty, and banging tons of biddies in that bed. Imagine having to kiss those sheets every morning. That's the real poison. RIP, dude. Mint essence oil under the nose, and I'm just praying for you. When the standard of hygiene is so low, your only request is that X marks the spot. Eleanor Harmon, the author of The Royal Art of Poison, says royal palaces, some courtiers don't even bother to look for a chamber pot, but just dropped their britches and did their business. All of their business. All of it. All of it in the staircases, the hallways, or the fireplaces. In Versailles, women just pulled up their skirts to pee where they stood, and some men urinated off the balustrade in the middle of the royal chapel. The smelly truth is that Hampton Court, that of Henry VIII, was not well equipped to serve the bodily needs of hundreds upon hundreds of servants. During the king's boisterous banquets, busy servants regularly needed the call of nature, so they relieved themselves in hidden hallway corridors or on sizzling fireplaces that were cooking the food. I need a minute with that one. Anyways, the walls reeked of urine so badly that according to historian Lucy Worsley in her book If Walls Could Talk, the palace management would have had crosses chalked into the walls with the hope that people would be reluctant to desecrate a religious symbol. That's right. While servants were always encouraged to pee in vats, so their urine could be used to clean later, to keep servants and courtiers from urinating on the garden walls, Henry had large crosses painted in problem spots, I guess. But instead of deterring men from relieving themselves, what it did was literally give them a target. To fix the problem, Henry VIII then realized he had to make bathrooms, so he constructed a giant toilet block by the River Thames called the Great House of Easement. And of course, last but not least, fresh out the kitchen of Henry VIII is Dee's roasted chestnuts. King Henry VIII's kitchen at Hampton Court Palace was one of the largest kitchens in Europe, and obviously it would have had to be to service the banquets of grandeur I was just talking talking about. There were huge wood fireplaces producing an average of 800 to 1,000 meals in a day, courtesy of just a mere 200 cooks. Naturally, that amount of ovens and that amount of cooks in the kitchen, yeah, it's downright cozy. And the average of 1.3 million logs were burned, creating a hellish atmosphere, leaving the cooks drained and drenched in sweat. From roasting meats to boiling cauldrons, the kitchen of Henry VIII was no less than passing as the underworld. So, what happened in all this heat, dare say? Did they crack a window? Did they get some ice? Take a smoke break, maybe? Nah, the cooks just took off all their clothes to tolerate the temperature while it's cooking. Just to reiterate, all their clothes. All of them. But alas, the atrocities were never ending for these men, as King Henry VIII issued an order to stop being naked or in garments of such vileness as they do now, nor lie in the nights and days in the kitchen or the ground by the fireside. To combat the problem, clerks of the kitchen were instructed to purchase honest and wholesome garments for the staff. And guess what that was? There's a reason the apron covers the front.
But kicking off the list at number 10, must love licorice. Okay, we'll start off a little tame. Napoleon Bonaparte, the famous French emperor, the famous military leader from the 1800s. Napoleon Bonaparte was responsible for conquering a large part of Europe. Bet you didn't know he was obsessed with licorice though. Way too much. He would eat this all day, every day. Ugh, it feels gross. Look, as somebody who can't stand licorice, I already feel bad for Josephine. Licorice breath at any time of the day coming your way? No thank you. I'll hard pass. Napoleon carried licorice around with him at all times. This guy ate so much of it, his teeth became stained. They turned black. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, it's black licorice too. Not the strawberry pull and peels, those are great. I'm talking about 1800s black licorice. It would come in lozenges. If somebody offered me a lozenge and it was black licorice, I'd call the police. Smack it out of their hands. Number 9, George IV. When it was time for King George III to pass on the crown, of course, next in line, heir to the throne, is his eldest son, also named George. What if you became king in 1820? Would you be noble? Would you do monologues in the sunset as you enriched your homeland? Kings like to do that a lot with their if I had the hair still. Or would you do what King George IV did and make horrible financial decisions every single day? The guy would just party all day as well. He would gamble every day, he would buy expensive stuff that he did not need, and on top of that, he would never do any of his royal duties. Guy wouldn't do his job. His father had to step in, classic. He figured the only way to settle all these new debts set in motion by George IV, in order to clear those up, George now has to marry his cousin, Caroline of Brunswick. The arranged marriage happened April 8th, 1795, and what was supposed to be a happy day for all was a nightmare for all included. They hated each other as soon as they met. I mean, obviously, he was a fool. George got heavily intoxicated for the wedding. He was just hammered the entire time. And then 9 months later, almost to the day, they had a child. And then right after that happened, they went their separate ways. So yeah, horribly unhealthy relationship. Once George became king in 1820, he then tried to divorce her. Like, what a fool. Just let it go. Let it all go. Let her go. Number 8, Filippo Maria Visconti. The Duke of Milan during the 14th century was at first Gian Maria Visconti, but after he was taken out, his brother, Filippo Maria Visconti, had to step up to the bat. As a ruler, Filippo was better. His brother had been cruel previously, hence the untimely departure. So this was a good move at first, so we thought. Now Filippo had to take over come 1412. Filippo was better than his brother on paper. He helped reorganize government finances. He got the silk industry up and running, which we love that. He ended up passing away of natural causes down the road, which is, nothing like his brother. But while he was in power, he never showed his face to anybody, not even people close to him. He hid in his palace most of the time, and it was odd because he thought that he was ugly. That's why he hid his face. Kind of sad, right? Filippo hid his face, and maybe you feel bad for him now, right? Just a little bit. He died of natural causes and he was alone all that time. Yeah, don't feel bad for him. This guy was horrible. He was jealous of his wife Beatrice Lascaris de Tenda because she was twice his age, twice as smart, and twice as powerful. So Filippo had her taken out in a courtyard publicly September 13th, 1418. Yeah, he accused her of adultery just cause he could, and he had some suspicions in his dark room by himself hiding his face. History is ugly, and sometimes it's literally ugly as well. Number 7, George I. King George I, couple of Georges on this list, okay? Long before his British ruling days, George was in Germany. He was actually the elector there, and he'd been married before around 1682. Originally, he married Sophia Dorothea of Seal, but But the entire time they were married, it was horrible. George would straight up bring other women home because he just felt like he could. Like he literally argued that he could, given his role. He's like, oh, I could have these women and we could do all this in front of you. Of course, I'm this person of this. Like, no, you're a fool. You're a jerk, really. He would have numerous mistresses and he would purposely flaunt them. So Sophia thought, okay, if you can have numerous side hustles going on, I'll move on myself. So she began seeing a Swedish count. Okay. She began seeing Philip Christoph von Königsmark. Now when George inevitably found out, he was violent at this point. He was upset, he divorced Sophia and then imprisoned her. Yeah, when he became king of Britain later on in 1714, she didn't come with him. Yeah, it's not just horrible with Sophia either. The Duke had also been taken out, sadly. His love for Sophia ended up getting him killed. What a mess. All these Georges are so messy, the worst. If your name's George, don't be a mess. Just be nice. Hit that thumbs up if you're a George. Change the game. Change the stats up. Number 6, heir to the throne. Okay, I kicked out this list roasting Napoleon and his licorice choices, but of course, he's done much worse things than have bad breath and stained teeth. Napoleon's marriage to Josephine was first fueled by love and friendship, but things quickly changed. Marie Josephine Rosé Tacher de la Pagerie was born in 1763. She had 2 children with her first husband, but that marriage was also not a happy time. They separated, and Josephine met Napoleon in 1795. Napoleon at this point was married at the time, and they had an affair, and they were deeply in love, like actually in love, and Napoleon proposed to Josephine in 1796, and they married later that year. 2 days after their wedding, Napoleon led the French army in Italy, and while he was gone, both of them ended up having affairs. So many affairs in this. Like, does love even exist? What the hell? 1804, Napoleon crowned himself and then crowned Josephine, proclaiming her empress. A few years passed, and after finding out Josephine couldn't bear any more children, Napoleon made a list of possible and eligible princesses. Just a list, and just left it out. Like, how awful is that? In November 1809, Josephine agreed to the divorce, and come 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte's final word on his deathbed was Josephine. Yeah, a little darker than licorice, just a tad.
Number 5, King of Egypt. His Majesty Farouk I, by the grace of God, King of Egypt and the Sudan, that was his full title, was disposed during his nation's 1952 revolution and spent the remainder of his days in exile to Italy. In his haste to avoid getting the Mussolini treatment, he left behind a majority of his most prized possessions. When the people got a look at what he was storing behind the walls of his residence, they were a bit disgusted to find an excessive number of expensive suits, rare stamps and coins, jewels, luxury vehicles, and many other things that I will never afford. Now, what else would he have that would be considered strange? I'll let you take a guess. Was it A, a blam blam cachet, B, piles and piles of a white substance that made the 80s fun, or C, an unsettling amount of gardening magazines? Go ahead and let us know in the comments below. I'll give you a second. Nope, time's up. If you said secret option D, you'd be right. What was it, you ask? Well, it was a disturbing amount of adult entertainment. So much so, it wouldn't even fit underneath his mattress. Man, that's a lot. That's too much. That's too much. Number 4, Peter III. Remember the last time you played with your toys as a kid? Same. And let us know what your favorite toys were as a kid. Let's see if we have some shared favorites. I'm actually curious. That's kind of a cool thing to talk about. Well, for Peter III, it was little army men, or tin soldiers, I guess you'd call them. And yes, he played with them as an adult, staging mock battles. Is it the weirdest thing ever? No, it's not. But he was a king, so that's a wee bit strange. Hey, I love army men just as much as the next guy, especially those little green plastic dudes. I used to love those video games too. Very underrated in my opinion. Love that stuff. It also makes me think of that scene in Spaceballs. Enough references aside, you never really know someone until you've seen the money they've spent on their army men collection. Number 3, Ibrahim I. Fur everywhere. Ibrahim I of the Ottoman Empire was the 18th Sultan and the #1 purchaser of fine furs. Personally, I've never had any fine furs. I grew up in the trailer park and Mama always said that fur was cruel anyway, so I never felt the luxury of fine furs, if you will. It must be nice because Ibrahim loved them so much. Like, he really loved them. His whole wardrobe consisted of them, in fact. Plus, his walls were covered in them, and apparently even his curtains. I don't do well in heat, so I'll pass on that. I'd be sweating way too much. Too much fur. Number 2, the locksmith. Who are you and how'd you get in here? I'm the locksmith, and I'm the locksmith. Classic Leslie Nielsen. God, I love that guy. I love those movies. I'd love to make one day. Or star in one. Hollywood, call me. King Louis XVI, the last king of France. We're back to him again. The man spent his time and money on something rather strange. No, not all was spent on his wife and her life, and yeah, I'm kind of putting him on the list twice, but trust me, it's weird. I mean, come on, he gave the queen whatever the heck she wanted. Well, apparently he loved to spend his time and money on locksmithing. What? Yeah, that's so weird. He would spend his time trying to get into locks and understand them. He was also stated as saying that every man should have a passion. Hey, maybe put down the locks and start helping the people as a passion. There's an idea. What a great idea. Feed the people. Instead, I'm just going to work on this lock. I'm just going to go ahead and just, yeah, almost got it. Yep. Number 1, Christian VII of Denmark. I saw this and I just had to put it on here. I mean, come on. Apparently the guy wasn't very mentally stable. I mean, who is these days? Apparently the royal spent a lot of his time waxing his carrot, polishing the flagpole, tenderizing the gabagoo, charming the snake, self-firing on all cylinders, the one-handed bedroom dance, what I did all summer long in high school. You get the point, okay? You understand what I'm trying to say. Truth of the matter is, you don't get there with a little help from Vaseline or St. Ives. The man bought time so he could be this way. The man is either a legend or a crazy person. Imagine having that much money and that much time in your day that that's all you do.